EG is building champions, an empire for North America. And we have assembled a team that represents the best of North America. And we're going to do it our way. Fight us, and you will bleed. Evil still lives in North America. Remember, we are evil.
Welcome back to the Four Horsemen. We are finally starting our series, The EG Files. I know you guys have been waiting a long time for this, and we are going to start here with the history of evil geniuses. So I know a lot of you guys want to talk about the more recent happenings, the more recent scandals, the current state of the team, but we're going to put that on hold because we got to start with the very beginning, because to understand why it's so appalling that EG is in the state it's in now, you have to understand a 20-plus year history of this org. And there were some legitimately good times for this org in the early days and a lot of fan affinity. Also, guys, you may be wondering why we don't have a fourth horseman for this episode.
It's Roger Ebert.
It's Roger Ebert. You guys
Yeah, Roger Ebert here already ahead of time.
Well, there were some people who were interested in doing this, but not in an they were not able to do it in an expedient fashion. There are also a limited number of people that are capable of talking about kind of the old days on EG.
It's my free shit joke for you, Monty, right? Only put the last Roger Ebert. Are you ready? This is for Richard, actually. It's only for Richard, this one, which is obviously Roger Ebert would be incredibly proud to be an Astralis fan, Richard, because they're the last people to put together 4 fraudulent stars.
Yeah, not bad. Not bad.
Not bad.
Not bad. All right.
It's a little bit nuanced.
Yeah, also completely irrelevant to this
podcast. To do this.
No, it's good. But I'm like you. I'm kind of like I'm gearing up for the history. I want it to be loose. We don't even have a guest.
Yeah,
it's great.
let's do it.
This is how it should be. Free form.
Yeah. So we will have guests for future episodes of this series, but basically, guys, what you need to know is that with EG there are a lot of, well, I mean, let me put it this way: there is some combination of people that we don't like, people who are NDA'd, people who have been part of the Sumail trial and can't say things. And people who have completely kind of washed out of the scene. So reaching back this far in history is difficult.
I'll tell you, Monty, the very quick reason why there isn't a fourth horseman is because this entire industry has let everyone down. Because you know how for 20 years you've all said, anyone could just get a webcam or look stuff up on Liquipedia and do what Thorin does. But surprisingly, 2024 we're in now, and is there a fourth guest that we could bring on who could talk about the history of one of the most famous orgs? And no, there isn't. They don't exist. As Monty says, they would have to literally be someone who worked for the team, and that's it. Because the other joke goes like this: even if there was some nerd out there who knows like ancient Quake or Counter-Strike history or was in the StarCraft 2 scene, they don't have any personal brand and you don't know their name and they're not at all famous. So the joke is, sadly, this is actually why shows like this and in general the sorts of work we do. I always tell people this, like, I don't just stick around just to do like random content and just be like, lol, who cares, I'm famous. Like, I actually do think like it's necessary, some of the stuff we do. I think if we don't like tell the stories or explain certain information to people, it'll get lost. Sadly, it will just be tears in the rain. It'll just be gone.
Yeah, well, I mean, think about how many websites we've worked for down the years.
For sure.
I mean, like, I lost all the, I've got it on a hard drive.
We even lose our own shit, right? Sometimes you can find your own stuff.
That's what I mean. True. I've got most of it on hard drives. I mean, at this point, after 20 years, I'm going to have to, like, fire old shit up in laptops. Yep. Like, I don't know where all the GotFrag stuff is, and it's like, I've probably written for about 5 or 6 websites that have just, like, gone under. They just don't exist anymore, and all of that work is gone with it. Not to mention stuff like, the CGS did all the video work there. Just all gone.
Sure. Yes.
Yeah, just all gone. All the writing, all the video work. They just said, we own that. No one can have that. You know, I mean, film stuff with fucking E. It's not like it's just an old school thing that happens. I film stuff with E-League that never seen the light of day. So, yeah, it's tough. It's like you have to stick around to sort of preserve the history. It's why I say the branding of the esports historian is on point, because whether people realize it or not, there's hardly anybody doing any form of curation whatsoever.
Yep.
And the problem we have is with algorithms designed to pump out things based on what's current, not what's past. Even our social media platforms that we use, things like Twitter, YouTube, all of this stuff, it's really bad for archiving. It's really hard to find an old tweet. It's really hard, you know, unless you specifically know what you're looking for. It's not easy to find a YouTube video either, specific one. So that's kind of what you're up against. And like you say, I mean, look, this is before even my time in esports. The foundation of EG and the early EG. I kind of got into EG when they, obviously through Counter-Strike, and then obviously probably the period I interfaced with them the most and had all the personal running battles with Alex Garfield, who, you know, he's a friend now, but he was a nemesis for a long period of time because he was like what an esports villain was, you know, back then. And of course, now he would just be a normal.
He was lovable,
dude. Yeah, exactly. So I mean, you know, the StarCraft era, I've got a ton of shit from, but I'm kind of interested in some of the crazier times from back in the day.
Oh, I will say, by the way, we're not claiming on this episode that this is like I went away and did 50 hours research of the history of the org. This is, for my opinion, this is going to basically be like an oral history. I'm going to sort of tell you like things I can remember. And I'm going to make like loose connections, but I can tell you the gist of the story of the clan, basically. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, before we start that, maybe we should talk about our sponsor for this episode. Guys.
Evil Geniuses.
Evil Geniuses.
It's also fitting because if you don't know, Evil Geniuses is probably the best org in the history of esports relative to its start at getting sponsorship. So it's only fitting we start by ourselves getting some skrill.
Indeed.
That's right, guys. We are now part of the EG Creator Collective. We certainly aren't just going to disappear like Danny did, and then they'll close the Creator Collective down without actually saying anything. So it's weird that, Danny just became a streamer for like 2 weeks and then didn't stream ever again. And then they shut down the Creator Collective.
It was fitting that the game he played, though, was called The Lost Ark, and he was put into a Creator Collective program and then just disappeared completely. So there you go.
Not bad.
Except the problem was, obviously, the joke there would be that it's evil geniuses themselves that God would need to wipe from the earth to remove all the degeneracy and evil and start afresh. But in some ways, that has happened. They've internally cleansed the temple, some would say.
Indeed.
All right, guys. Our sponsor this week is Factor. They are back. And this isn't going to be, and this is a deep cut for you guys. I don't even know if we're going to get around to this. This isn't a pizza.gg. You will actually get.
When he keep going. That was a good reference. If you don't know, Richard did an old column. Look it up. Pizza GG, Richard Lewis. Look it up.
This isn't a pizza.gg. When you go to Factor, you will in fact get your food. We promise you.
There you go.
So Factor obviously sends to your house fresh, never frozen, chef-crafted, dietitian-approved meals ready to go in just 2 minutes. 35 different options to choose from every week, including different diets, so Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, Keto, and then do 60 add-ons, including pancakes, smoothies, snacks, more that all go into your box. And guys, you can get it for cheaper than you're getting takeout right now. So if it's purely an issue of effort or time that you guys are not eating better, this is going to be healthier for you. It's going to be cheaper a lot of the time too. It's all delivered to you. No prep, no mess, nothing like that. Just heat them up. Everybody swears by them. I'm sad I can't get them right now. It'd be great for me while I've been streaming, but I am currently in Korea. But those of you who are, in the States, or in the other countries in which they serve, this is a great opportunity to go get it. And of course, helping, supporting our sponsors is what supports us the best, guys. And I know you've heard the read on before, but we did change our code, although our old code also works. So you can use either code, Horseman or Horsemen, singular or plural. but you can head to factormeals.com/horsemen50 and use code horsemen50 to get 50% off. That's code horsemen50 at factormeals.com/horsemen50 to get 50% off. So go ahead, treat yourself, get some nice food, save yourself some money. I think if you guys look at how much money you're probably spending on takeout, this is probably going to be a cheaper option for you and almost certainly better for you as well. So thank you to Factor for sponsoring our show. All right, so let's start with EG, because again, guys, the reason we want to do these earlier episodes, which is prior to the Peak 6 acquisition, where everything really started to go downhill, is because many of you don't actually know what EG was prior to their entrance into, well, their, I should say, second entrance into League of Legends. Their acquisition of the franchise spots, maybe the shenanigans that were occurring with their multi-team rosters over in Counter-Strike. But the reason why people are so broken up about this is because this org does have a rich history, and at one time was kind of the most prestigious premier organization in North America, like up there with Team Liquid, and certainly the most commercially successful in terms of sponsorships. And so we wanted to talk about that history first, give you guys a sense of what went on. So I think Thorin, we probably have to kick it off here, because he predates both Richard and me in terms of knowing about the origins of this org, because by the time that I got in here, it was much more of, and like EG started to really rise, it was much more of the Alex Garfield era of the org. So Thorin, where do you want to start?
Right, the key thing to understand about Evil Geniuses is it actually legitimately is one of the oldest teams, depending on what you mean by the word team, in esports. So if people don't know, the European equivalent is obviously SK Gaming, which is obviously to this day still a giant org, still an LEC. They have a whole bunch of teams in different games, etc. And that, just like Evil Geniuses, began as a Quake clan. Now, people need to know, Quake clan was just a team, basically. And back then, when they even say like professional team, they just mean like we're sort of just making it known that we're trying to do this like full-time basically. It's not that you professionally make loads of money or a good salary. In fact, back then the joke is there was barely any prize money. This is literally Quake 1 we're talking about. So in Europe it's Quake World. In North America sometimes they played Quake World, sometimes they played Network Quake, depending on if they played the add-on or not. And basically, so back then the key thing to know is like this is really more just like you're a top team at the time. You're not an org, you're not like a business in the same way, like I say. So at the time they started in Quake, it was a Canadian organization most famously. If people don't know, actually Quake 1 in North America was a game that actually almost had no esports scene in terms of money, because the problem it had was Quake 2, the game came out pretty quickly afterwards. It was like something like 1 or 2 years later. And so a lot of the competitions were 1v1 anyway, and they switched to Quake 2. And so it was more in Europe where people kept playing Quake 1. So this was a team that I wasn't even necessarily like the best one. There was obviously an American team called American Gangsters, people remember the best, but they were a top team. They had some decent players. And crucially, it was actually the Canadian element that I would say is the most relevant part about this, because then later in Counter-Strike, when Counter-Strike came along a year or two after Quake World and Quake 2, at the same time Quake 3 was around, Counter-Strike came along, and famously Counter-Strike actually usurped or cocked Quake, because what happened was Quake was the main game, because that was actually the like what everyone was passionate about, and they sort of, the joke is, made the esports scene to have tournaments for. But then the first big tournaments, people like the CPL in North America with Angel Munoz and the World Cyber Games with Samsung in South Korea, quickly realized, well, actually the grassroots phenomenon game is Counter-Strike. That's the one that has all the viewership and all the, well, didn't have viewership yet, but it had all the players basically. So you can have a way bigger player base. So they all started to pivot into that. And actually this team, this is the key detail, was not in the early days. Whereas I gave the SK Gaming example, SK Gaming in pretty much every game they were in until more recently when they went a bit more budget, they were always one of the biggest orgs. They were always the one with the most money, with the most sponsorship. Actually, EG in the early Counter-Strike days was very much just based around the theme that they were Canadian, if people don't know. Like actually, I would say think of teams before they got big, like ENCE in Counter-Strike, where the initial thing was like, hey, we know that there's only 1 or 2 good Finnish players, but what if we made an all-Finnish team and we tried to get good, you know, instead of an Alu just going to another team? What if he played for us and we tried to make it up? So basically at the time, the entire reason EG was a popular team or had any interest was they had a player called Stevenson, who basically was one of those rare players where he actually did just want to play with his mates and people who were Canadian, as opposed to, I can tell you right now, he had offers from teams like Team 3D and Complex, like the best teams in the whole country, basically. And so because he would stay and play in their team, it meant basically they had a player a la a Tabson in Big Now, who's like way overqualified like to be in that team. But because you're doing it for a canny reason, like I'm staying with my friends, so I'm doing it for the country, it's kind of like a cool theme, isn't it? So they had their own sort of little niche cult follow, I would say. But the team itself wasn't actually very good. Like we're talking early 2000s here. This is a team that basically, if they went to the events, usually what would happen was they were like on the brink of being interesting. Like because they had this guy that was overqualified and then a couple of like decent players, they're all invite level players. They would go to the tournament and then basically they'd usually come say like 8th place or 9th place or something, which is like, oh, it's like the joke of the Django and Light Chain one, isn't it? Like it's a difference between having the curiosity and your attention, you know, like they were almost doing it. It was mainly just this one guy. But the one positive in this era was because they had this one guy who was cracked out and was better than the team. Well, there was another famous Canadian player. This is why I gave the Ents example, which is obviously Shagwaba, who used to play in the international teams, Team 3D. Well, when you would have the World Cyber Games, because it was like WESG or the Olympics, you have to be from that country. Well, Team 3D is an American team, so since he's Canadian, eventually he would play with them sometimes, and that actually allowed them to get like a bronze at a WCG. It was that bullshit one where you qualified in 1.6 and the actual fucking tournament was in CS Source, if you remember, the one that Team 3D famously won. He actually beat people like Groove from Gambit and Hooch in that match, if people don't know. And then they also had a famous CPL. It was one of the CPLs where ESWC had most of the teams. It was a bit stripped down, but they came second at one. They actually lost to the SK Gaming of people like Spawn and Vilden, these legendary players. So they had a couple of highs that were mainly based, like I say, on players who sort of were better than the org and were giving their time. And then I'd say the more interesting detail, this is where it's going to become quite relevant and quite modern quite fast, was actually the entry of Alex Garfield. And the reason why this is so significant is because when Alex Garfield first took over EG, by the way, as I say, I'm doing this all off the top of the head. This is an oral history. I'm not claiming I researched all of this. Basically, what happened was at the time Alex Garfield was looking after this team, as I said, they're just sort of like a secondary team. CGS had begun. And this is the key thing. Because the number one teams in America at the time was Complexity with Jason Lake and then Torble, who now is obviously with ESG, EFG, the ESL Faceit group.
He's Craig Levine. He's the CEO of, so Torbull, who owned 3D, is now the co-CEO of the ESL Faceit group. Just so you guys are clear on, these people still are around. Anyway, continue, Thorn.
But the point is, these people didn't run the teams then. So what they did is those people all sold their orgs, the biggest in America, to CGS. And so what's interesting is a lot of people don't know this detail. And this detail, if this was the movie, I've always made the joke that like the joke is you don't need to make a movie about Alex Garfield. The Social Network was already made, but it's like the fucking Social Network basically. Because what happened was at the same time Alex was on the side running EG, you know, a canny little one with his friends that were Canadian. He was also like, I think something mad, like assistant manager of Call or something. So he was like working with Call in some capacity. And the story goes that while the others were all distracted with doing CGS, because if people don't remember the story, Jason Lake had put all his money, his life into Call and basically never turned a fucking red cent in his entire time. So he's totally all in on CGS. And then Torbull, famously, never came back to team ownership after that, actually, because he had ESEA, which was a license to print money and obviously did that shady ass shit with the minor. That's unlimited money, so he never had to come back. So this basically was the Game of Thrones moment, crisis point, where Alex Garfield did his master stroke. Because what he did was, and supposedly this is why Col actually had quite a lot of beef with him at the time, he managed to sort of, while CGS was going on, so you're doing this big TV project on Direct TV, he was supposedly grinding where when these other orgs weren't out there looking for sponsorship because they're all participants in CGS, he was going to every bloody sponsor and he was doing it. This is why I said it'd be like the Social Network. He really was like a kid in a dorm or something, like, you know, like fucking getting it together and trying to look pro and like have a tie and going like, oh, hello, Mr. Nvidia. Yes, I'm here from a professional organizer. And essentially, if people don't know, he was faking it till he made it. He wasn't Alex Garfield yet. That's why I say this is like the Social Network. He was just a guy LARPing at it. But at the time, people were so mediocre in esports. And as I say, his competition was sort of distracted. And in the case of Jason Lake, he didn't know he was competition. And basically what supposedly happened is when CGS died off and there was this pivot where we were going to come back from playing CS Source to CS 1.6, magically he got the Complexity team to come and sign with him at EG, and then suddenly EG had all these sponsors, and famously Jason Lick basically implied like, you sort of snaked me, basically you sort of worked for me, and then used like my time and my like influence and stuff, I don't know, to pivot and put it all into your org. And then what happened then is that is actually the genesis, before even the StarCraft shit, of Evil Geniuses as you know it, because what he then did was he'd had in the meantime an all-right team play, it actually become a North American team instead of the Canadian one in the CGS era that had people like he famously found nothing. And when he got nothing, this is a key detail. Basically, Alex Garfield was smart enough to know what no one else did yet, which is media is about to become a huge thing in esports. So even though at the time, nothing on his own isn't like fucking Neo, he's like the best North American player, but he's not so like, but he was insanely marketable because he was like Macaulay Culkin of Counter-Strike, people don't know. He was like literally like the fucking wholesome, like 16-year-old, even doesn't even look threatening, looks like exactly what you'd want, like the game. It's exactly what you'd want you to say to your parents. Like, look, you can be a gamer and not be a fuck up. Look, this guy's like cool, he's a pro player, and he said all the right things. He was really good at the game. So famously, they then pivoted to make the org around him in Counter-Strike. And then probably the biggest move that a lot of people don't actually know is the past guest of the Four Horsemen guys, Tommy Lurpis, who was obviously Finnish, famously in a giant blockbuster move, was actually signed from this top Finnish team that had been doing loads of successful things the last few years to become, and this never used to happen, become a North American import. And he went over to North America and they had a team house and he played and became the in-game leader of this team that had the old legendary players like Fraud, etc. And then they had Nothing there, who's the young, as I say, poster boy of the org. And basically, this is already where they started to pivot and become a giant org, because immediately once they had Lurpus in, over the years, they would get better results. Like now, instead of being like Borderline, now they could maybe be like 4th or 5th, or they could like win a map off a Na'Vi or an SK, or they could sometimes occasionally fluke a win and actually get like a fight. Like famously, they once beat Fnatic that had Forrest and Get Right and Cooks and all those guys. It was an MSI beating in China, so it wasn't like a major or whatever, but still, you still beat them on LAN. And so this basically was the same time period. In fact, if people don't know, his little gem for you, the other person aside from Lopez they considered signing was fucking Neo, because this is actually the era when Neo had all those team problems. There could have been a world where Neo went over and was a giant. And what I'm getting the point of here is that basically already in Counter-Strike made them a giant org, because the reason these international players were going is because even though as a team they weren't top 5, they could pay you top 5 money. They could actually pay you at the time. Literally, I used to know what the SK guys made. If the SK guys made $1,200, and they were like the 3rd best team in the world, by the way, then EG players made like $1,100 a month or something. So like, again, a very, very competitive salary. And so crucially, you can see how a mixture of getting the backing, so you can now expand out essentially and buy bigger players, and then also understanding when to cynically maneuver around media personalities. So as in people who don't have to win, but they're enormously like successful and become a vector for more sponsorships, is then basically the playbook we can talk about now about StarCraft 2. You guys can comment, because obviously in StarCraft 2, I would say this is the org that is the most famous for signing big names ever. They got them all pretty much, it felt like.
Yeah, I can go back a little bit. There's actually a good period of overlap, because me and Alex kind of turn up at like the same time in esports. And so, you know, I was doing community writing, essentially blogging for a Counter-Strike source blog called Source Junkie. That was like where I got my start. And I went from that to Cadred, and then they were becoming official coverage partners at the CGS. There was some conflict I had with Cadred, and so I quit and went to Gotfrag, and Gotfrag were the anti-CGS NA-based.
I mean, they were owned by LG, right? So it was the main rival.
Exactly. And so what was going on there was basically when CGS came in, Scott Valencia and all those guys, they essentially bribed. There's no other way of framing it, and Duncan can attest to this. I believe he was one of the journalists they also attempted to bribe. Basically, what they wanted was just positive coverage about the game. And so if you were an official coverage partner, then you essentially were given the envelopes of money. Slasher just made a joke about it on Twitter the other day. They were literally sort of paying you to be there to do coverage. And this was a time before anyone disclosed shit.
Oh, of course, yeah.
There wasn't even like Twitter,
Yes.
There's no public vector for you to disclose. It would have to be baked into the articles themselves. And so what I was already starting to get a reputation in 2006, 2007 as the iconoclastic guy. He was the guy who, I for example, went to do coverage at CGS. They relented, and they gave Gotfrag the ability to go there. There was a UK-based event because 2 of the franchises were UK. I could go to these things and see behind the scenes, and I was reporting what I saw accurately, which is that a lot of these drafts were fixed. Now, I've got friends that still deny it to my face to this day. And it's just like politics. It's just one of those things where it's like, look, we're never going to agree, so let's not talk about it. But I mean, I saw on the ground floor sort of the construction of how everybody was working hand in glove at the CGS, which is relevant to EG. EG had been approached. EG had been sounded out about going there. Same as Fnatic, who were another big source brand, had been sounded out about going there. But they didn't like the deal that was on the table. And so CGS were fucking ruthless with people that didn't comply and didn't come along for the ride. So, for example, they made a point of like, you know, one of the machinations was the Fnatic Dutch source team. They were like, you've got to break them apart. You can't have those 5 play together because then they'll just dominate because they're the best team in the world right now.
Okay.
So and also people will associate them tangentially with the Fnatic brand. So make sure we split them apart. And that's how you got, you know, Dutch players playing with Fifth Lauren, who was like a franchise player, and they didn't vibe with each other at all. But they actively disliked each other from the competitive scene before anything had sort of happened. So anyway, there was all that bullshit going on, and I was reporting it, but you know, obviously, this is where people started to threaten me and do all that stuff, and the wonderful world of esports was opened up to me. Now, all of this is relevant because, as Duncan rightly points out, during that time, it was actually a godsend for Alex Garfield. This was his fucking opportunity to essentially go and get everything that wasn't associated with CGS. And here's another thing that people won't remember. CGS actively lied about some of the sponsors on their website. They didn't have deals. They just put their logo there. And it was like just a sort of corporate phone call, like, do you mind? There was no money coming in off those sponsors. It had to be successful. I mean, understand that the building they built for it in Birmingham, Amiga Sector, which was a Kazakhstani, like the guy was on like Interpol, one of the financiers for that was on like an Interpol most wanted list or something, right? and it was a series of Kazakhstan.
Which became the most famous person in esports at the time, in theory.
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, Angel Munoz was still the godfather at this point. But anyway, so Amiga Sector is a series of LAN cafes in Kazakhstan. You can go look this up. Between the people at CGS and I think even Sujoy Roy, former Quake player, they'd managed to get this Kazakhstani guy to basically fund this building specifically for CGS on the proviso it's their business in the UK afterwards. But the problem was the business model for it could never work because it had to be, and I know because I ended up working there, it had to be 70% full 100% of the time.
Which is impossible in the UK if you don't know. Like, we didn't have the Korean land culture
to break even. Ever, right? To break even.
That could never happen. Never happen. And also, I'm going to guess, probably wasn't cheap. It probably was like fucking, you had to pay a few quid an hour, right?
No. So, I mean, look, so you had all of these issues. Like, the CGS looked like this big shining beacon. Everyone was finally getting salaries. Everything was good. But actually, there were a lot of people that weren't associated with it, didn't believe in the vision. You know, and CGS was given $60 million by News Corp, the Murdoch's, company. And they said, that's going to last us 5 years, no problem. And they burned through it in basically 2.5 because they kept doing dumb stuff like having qualifiers in the Playboy Mansion or, hosting events in LA, inviting celebrities.
We got cool pictures out of that.
Yeah. And inviting celebrities to like the after party to tap them up for investment. While that happened, and this is why I quickly identified Alex Garfield early on as a nemesis, because what I saw him do was, first of all, efficiently ruthless. What Alex was famous for at this period was anytime a sponsor was going to go to an NACS team, or even in the aftermath of CGS, maybe go to Complexity or Call.cs as it was at that period of time because they didn't have the brand. What he would do is as soon as he heard that, let's, again, just pick a brand, a random, in fact, I won't pick a brand because it'd probably be a thing. But let's just say, like Fruity Loops, there you go. They've never sponsored an esports team, I don't think. But, as soon as he heard Fruity Loops were on the phone to Jason Lake, he would go with a full court press with the decks. By the way, they were one of the pioneers in that area too. People sponsor decks. I don't even think I'd really seen orgs send them out, but EG had some of the slickest fucking, PowerPoint presentations you ever did see, all professionally done. Because I think Alex studied like business at university.
Makes sense.
And so he was knocking it out the park. And so every time a sponsor had a verbal agreement with Jason Lake or Jason Bass, Complexity, or whoever else it was, he would get in there and he would snake it from them. And he'd snake players as well. Oh, you're on the market, are you? I can get you more money. What's really interesting about Alex Garfield and why I saw him very early on as like a nemesis that I wanted to stop was because he was using Robin Hood philosophy like out loud. He would say to players, I can get you a better deal. These guys don't care about you. I genuinely do. I'll get you more money. We're a player-centric org. These terms didn't exist in esports at this moment in time. You could be the best player, but it was still very much about the badge, personal brand. Yeah, maybe outside of some of the early days of Quake where, you got some headlines because you won a car or whatever the fuck it was. But ultimately, it was about playing for Four Kings or it was about playing for SK or, whoever it was. Personal brands didn't really matter as much. And so anyway, he would go and say, like, we're a player-ran org, we're player-centric. We'll get you more deals. We'll cut you in. We can even, he started structuring bonus payments for deliverables. Alex Garfield was a progenitor of all the influencer culture that eventually came in. And so understand, here was someone that was being, in my opinion, shady and snaky and not caring about the ecosystem. He wanted it all for Evil Geniuses. All the gold, all the sponsors, all the attention, all the players. But also on top of that, he was sort of bringing players along for that. So it made it it was completely non-viable for them to even give anyone else a chance. And so ultimately, over time, the ruthless efficiency that Alex applied to his business basically meant Evil Geniuses became the only show in town in NA. And obviously, that's fine when CGS exists, but when CGS collapses in 2008, technically 2008/2009, because of the subprime mortgage crisis, just fucking killed everything stone dead. CGS would have died without that, but that was why they literally closed the league down and told everyone via email the same day. But basically, he did all of that and made hay while the sun was shining on somebody else. And then they came back to NA Esports and went, right, well, surely we can get sponsors and that now. Well, no, you can't. Alex has got them all. Why would I go to Checks Notes, Call.cs? Why would I go to second gen, like Team 3D, whatever was happening there? And if you look actually at some of the orgs that were active at that time, across all of across esports, it's a fucking wasteland. Evil Geniuses somehow used the CGS by basically not backing that horse to basically parlay it into becoming the number one organization in NA.
I think it also helped that EG was focused on games that weren't a part of the CGS, right? Because in the CGS, it was Counter-Strike Source, like a couple racing games, Dead or Alive 4. What else was?
I can tell you exactly. Yeah, Source. It was Source, FIFA, Dead or Alive,
Need for Speed. What was the driving game?
Project Gotham Racing.
Project Gotham. There you go.
Yeah, and
FIFA.
Did we say FIFA? Yeah. So I mean,
and it was male and female beat 'em up also. So yeah.
And they had a male and a female on Dead or Alive. So I mean, it was like, and also as well, the format was, as we've joked about before, it was a team effort. So all your team, all your franchise had to play, and it was MR9 in Counter-Strike Source. So if you got first to 10, in other words, so Americans could understand it. And they did that, but if each round you won over the top, so if you won 10-2, that was 8 points. But then obviously what would always happen was if your fighter was shit and they got fucking dusted 5-0, you just lost 5 immediately.
Yes.
And so,
and I think the racing one was the best one because you always come first place in that one, right? So whoever comes first just gets all the points. So the joke is it never worked.
Yeah, it's exactly. So ultimately, all of the artifice around the drafts and who built the best team and all that was academic, really, because having a good Counter-Strike team didn't mean that much. In fact, the real tech was, to probably have the best fighter that you could get and the best racer that you could get.
Yes.
So, but anyway, yeah. So,
my point is that with the games that CGS was focused on, there were a variety of other games that were on the up and up at the time, and especially games that would eventually become more popular that EG was more interested in signing. Like, there were no Blizzard games, even though Blizzard during this time period was hugely popular, right?
Well, what's also interesting is the one area where it sort of looked like EG might have something to do with the CGS was when they went into WoW Arena. Because people forget, CGS ran a World of Warcraft Arena tournament. I think Joe Miller and Too Good did the commentary for that, if memory serves me correct. Could be wrong there. But anyway, they did a one-off sponsored by Dell, probably not a real sponsor. They did a one-off World of Warcraft Arena tournament in 2000, and that must have been 2007. And EG were in WoW Arena in 2007. So I mean, they were adjacent to it. But you're right, because they didn't believe in the vision, and because Alex had been sounded out. They would have had a franchise like, I don't know, the LA Geniuses or, something like, would have been like that. He didn't want to go with that. He didn't believe in CGS at all. Certainly wasn't going to sell the brand, wasn't going to acquiesce to that agreement, which you had to do. You had to give the brand over as an asset. They paid you for it. And in exchange gave you a GM job. That was the deal.
And Richard, wasn't it true that there was there was a time where there was a clawback of the brands after CGS shut
They just
down,
gave someone
right?
back, I believe. I think they just gave Jason his back, for example, because they didn't.
Well, no, he did have to sue them.
Okay.
Well, not sue them. It's like, it's not probate. That's like when someone's dead, but there's a word for it. Basically, the company wasn't technically dead. CGS and got transferred over to the owners of the new CPL, and then it got transferred to something like called Wulong Holdings, and it was like just all being moved around.
Well, obviously found the alien later on, centuries later from now.
Yeah, the Leyland Yutani, it was all there, and look, they Wayland Yutani, I should say. But anyway, they basically owned all the assets, and that included Complexity, and I imagine for a time as well the 3D brand,
New York
brand,
or whatever, yeah, sure.
brand as well. But anyway, Jason went through the courts to basically get it back. He got it back for $1,000. I've always lied and said he got it back for $1, but it actually was $1,000. But may as well be $1, right? So I mean,
he keeps paying more and more to get Complexity back. It's crazy.
I know 10 million is a bit much more than 1,000. But yeah, so I mean that was why Alex had sort of completely rejected the idea of the CGS, because obviously Alex, as I said, he's a ruthless motherfucker at this period of time, and as we'll get to as well, hilariously over the top with the PR.
Oh, it's hilarious,
stuff.
Yes.
Yeah, that was he was
always Vince McMahon at one point in time for real, but he was real though.
He was ruthless, he was ruthless behind the scenes, but he was also very sanctimonious and pious in public with his statements, which made it made me fascinated with him. Like, I was like, okay, this is the kind of new breed of like slick huckster we're gonna have in esports, and I'm gonna watch this guy very, very closely because I think he's gonna be up to no good. And as it happened, he did do a few things I disagree with, but obviously compared to what we deal with now on a daily basis, absolutely, it's absolutely nothing.
But my point to bringing that up is like there was also a time after the CGS collapse where the other big name teams in that time period couldn't actually compete for sponsorships because they were still trying to work out their extrication from CGS.
And think about what Richard said, that they're also not only, Monty, going from being in a system where you're essentially like an NFL franchise, so you're just doing the sports part of it, like making your team, to like not only have you been told tomorrow, like right back into the open market, but then also not only has the other guy scooped all the sponsors using, by the way, more advanced methods than you, like Richard said, like actually looking professional, but even worse, you're now doing it when the subprime mortgage has just hit. And just like right now, when esports winter happens, every dollar that could be wasted on stupid video games isn't there anymore. So it's the worst time ever to try and like start from zero against this guy. And I've got a quick other anecdote I can tell people here because it's another oral history, but it's actually quite significant because it'll show you why the story, the prettiest way, this episode really is Alex Garfield. It's not really about Evil Geniuses. Like I told you, Evil Geniuses was a small Canadian Quake team and then a small Canadian Counter-Strike team. And then basically Alex Garfield is the reason reason this becomes an interesting story. And the reason why I've set him up as a Mark Zuckerberg / Steve Jobs / Elon Musk-esque figure is because that really is what kind of a person he was and how he just cut through this industry like the cliched hot knife through fucking butter. Because one of the details people don't know, this is why, even though now the joke is even fucking Nicola Nyholm seems interesting compared to the boring faceless wankers that run like EFG, for example. The reason why actually Nicola Nyholm was never that impressive to me, homie, is because you were just the fucking shitty remix of Alex Garfield. Because I'm going to tell you a story right now. A lot of people sadly don't even know the story about Nicola Nyholm, but Richard reported it all. Basically, Nicola Nyholm wanted, cleverly, at a time when it was possible, to own everything. He wanted it to be where he had the tournament organizer, Refresh, running Blast, and then in Blast, there would be his team, Astralis, and then his other team, Heroic, and then another team he helped fund, Godsend, and all these orgs, eventually, the joke was one day, maybe even, like, let's just say, let's put it on the table as a crazy idea, maybe the SKs and MIBRs of the world one day sell their orgs, and suddenly, you know those little Blast events, guys, that were like 6 teams? Maybe they're just all owned by the same people, and then you've got a completely sealed off ecosystem that's just Nicola Nyholm world, and we just get to live in it. And he has the teams, the organizer, and then the joke is, I imagine you'd probably get a vetting sponsor at one point in time. You make your own little like fucked up, like remember when the American Black Mirror one started, you all love that episode where he goes and buzz like Captain Kirk and he can just abuse all those people in his fantasy world. That's what Nicola Nyholm wanted, his own little fucking god domain where he could do it. Basically, the joke is Alex Garfield ran that script fucking literally like 7 years earlier, mate. Because Alex Garfield during CGS also had a very interesting pivot, Monty, that almost worked, but the key word is only almost, which is when this era of CGS happened, the reason Alex Garfield had this window was because he came from Counter-Strike. And in Counter-Strike, as you're pointing out, they stupidly chose, because they asked Valve to go with Source as the game for CGS. And in doing so, this is one of the biggest fumbles ever. You left the game people actually considered the better and more popular game, CS 1.6, available to be played. And Valve obviously didn't say it. Only CGS could do it. In fact, Valve even told CGS, you can't have a license for 1.6. It has to only be Source, because supposedly loads of the players and teams like Torbot so did push back and say, just do 1.6 and we'll all join the league. So basically, what Alex Garfield identified was, wait a minute, so my actual like game that I've succeeded from is a game that's essentially old and it's not going to be supported by the developer, but the developer's supporting this game's Source that no one likes. So his genius eureka moment was, he was one of the people who funded CS Pro Mod. Now, you're going to go, I don't remember CS Pro. That's the problem. Basically, he funded people to code a literal version of CS 1.6 in the Source engine. So basically, what everyone had been told for years, including dickhead people like K-Sharp were always telling me because they were friends with fucking Valve devs. That's right, dick faces. You're all going, well, do you know about Valve? I knew shit about Valve from 2006, you fucking rat. You've never contacted a Valve person. You've just read a shit comment by someone with a Scottish surname on Twitter, and you imagine that means you know what Valve does. By the way, those wankers weren't even there when I was around. So basically, Valve famously used to always say, we actually tried to make Source like 1.6. It just can't be done. Well, what ProMod proved, because I've played it, there was a beta version that was made, was they reviewed it. They literally did what it said on the tin. They just made Source feel like, for example, when you fired the M4A1S, it felt like the CS 1.61. So it was like, holy shit, wait a minute. Because the dream Alex Garfield had was, we obviously need a newer game because I'm going to these sponsors and they're telling me, like, wait, am I sponsoring this old blocky game, 1.6? That's not really that, what about Call of Duty? What about all the graphics? So his idea was, why don't we basically have a version that I'm going to control? I'm going to be the owner of the new version of Counter-Strike and we're all competitively going to play it. But unfortunately for him, one, it took way too many years because he actually was too ruthless. And I've heard shit, by the way, some hilarious shit behind the scenes in the fumble of this back. Like, they could have had a version made that would have been complete like 3 or 4 years early, but they did stupid stuff like tell the developer guy or the coder, like, yeah, you don't get any of the fucking profits. So then they would just be like, well, I'm off then, see ya. And they'd have to like keep starting over with like dev heads or some shit like that. And so the joke is, by the end, it didn't matter because CSGO itself came out in 2012 and they just took too long with this project. And then also what they missed was, and I don't blame Alex Garfield because no one knew this at the time, but at the time, the reason why it seemed like a clever idea was all of esports was grassroots created, as in it began with grassroots games that had massive player bases, and then tournaments did literally come from local LAN scenes. Things like even MLG guys came from local LAN circuits that built out and knew things like, I've got a cheaper route of people, or I can go to this place in the Midwest instead of LA and get a cheaper venue or whatever. And so basically what Alex Garfield didn't know, unfortunately, with the Pro Mode thing, was because now we're coming into like 2010, 2011, 2012. This is the era when esports just becomes about, does the game dev support your game or not? So if the game dev does, like Riot Games, famously Riot Games came in and told people like ESL, we'll just give you all the prize money. Then they came in and told the teams, put a team in LCS, we'll just give you the fucking salaries for them. So unsurprisingly, when you do this, same with CS, obviously eventually there was going to be the majors and all that. The real problem was there was never the moment Alex Garfield presumably hoped would happen of like, right, are we going to switch from 1.6 to Alex Garfield's Pro Mod or CSGO? There was never that conversation. It was just we're switching to CSGO. That's it. And so basically this whole Pro Mod thing never went anywhere. But I do think what's key about it is it shows that he was not just a guy who did some cool deals in a business room. He's actually a person, like I say, who had incredibly ambitious like scope of like ideas of what he thought esports could be. And in this scenario, he essentially wanted to be like the god emperor of it all. Like I say, he really did attempt this way before Nicola Nyom. So what I think that'll show you, and by the way, the reason this leads into now the other stuff that we can all talk about is if people don't know that thing Richard just said there about how he had all the sponsors, people need to know one of the biggest pull your dick out and slap your opponent in the face with it and he can't do anything and then you put your dick away again is when he created Alliance. Guys, that is the biggest flex in the history of esports, because what Alliance was this. It was pretended that it was a totally separate org based in Europe and run by people like, I think like Milk or something, the Dota player, right? But the reality of the org was Alex Garfield had completed nightmare mode of getting sponsors in NA to the extent he couldn't fit more sponsors into fucking EG. So instead of, whereas like 10 years earlier, Torpal did that with Titan 3D and went, right, well, I haven't got any more spots on my org, so I guess, you know what, fuck it, I'll even introduce you to some of my rivals like United 5. Why don't you sponsor them? Instead, Alex Garfield goes, oh, you have more sponsorship money. Well, it just so happens someone who isn't me has a second team in Europe, and the joke is he just got them to sponsor 2 teams that were both his. And you remember, are you ready for the punchline, guys? With each org, he then won TI. Mic drop. At that point, by the way, he never had to do another thing in esports ever, and he just fucking like completed the game and swagged on everyone. So that gives you a sense of who this guy was. Because notice what I did there. I didn't paint it all that was all great stuff. But like Richard says, you can't argue with what the guy was trying to do, though. That's some gangster shit. Like if this is the Wolf of Wall Street with Martin Scorsese, you would all be loving this fucking character right now. You'd be like, I can't wait until he does the drug bender, but this is the shit right now. I'm loving the ascension.
And you know, look, like obviously it came at a cost in the sense that, you know, one of the reasons why, you know, EG sort of have at various points been actively disliked by a lot of people is no respect for the broader ecosystem, right? Which is something everyone always pays lip service to, but, you know, no one actually really follows through with it. Like everyone says, oh, we want healthy competition, as long as we can be at the top of it, of course. And so, you know, there was that aspect. But I'll give you another, you know, story from back in the day. This is like 2010. Obviously, they went on to have the Loaded brand. I think they moved that into being like a talent agency eventually. But like Loaded was an esports org as well. And basically, Evil Geniuses wanted the Heroes of Newerth team and some of the staff and the brand, but Loaded had a Counter-Strike team, a Call of Duty team, a Quake Live team, World of Warcraft players. And so what Evil Geniuses did is they just acquired Loaded, asset stripped it. They took all their sponsors, all the managers that they wanted to have, and the Heroes of Newerth team, which was very good at the time, and they let everybody else go. And by the way, that deal was done behind the scenes, that if you go and look at some of the statements around the acquisition, the players are like saying, well, we didn't know that was coming at all. And so, you know, look, but also one of the EG were great at controlling the narrative. You know what they did when they did that? They were a serious esports org that produced press releases, and they sent it to Reuters and the Associated Press. So what came down the pipe was, isn't it wonderful that we're bringing in Brandon Freytag into Evil Geniuses, and the Heroes of Newerth team that has done so well will be part of our successful, and their partners will be... Not a single word mentioned about the people who were cut. And of course, that doesn't appear next to any of the quotes when they're going to, you know, news writers and saying, yeah, we didn't know it was coming. Like, just a masterclass in, like, if you've got to be a bastard to succeed, you do it like this. And so, there's tons of stories like that from that time period where basically he got what he wanted all of the time, and it always benefited him and EG, and everyone else be damned.
I can tell you a very brief personal anecdote without revealing like any super scandalous element that just shows you how I actually also can mirror what Richard said. When I saw this guy initially make these moves, initially I was just like, oh, maybe that's just a shrewd business move, or maybe he's even a true believer. Maybe he just does loves Counter-Strike and he wants like CS 1.6 in Source. By the way, that would be a very great angle to sell to me. But I very quickly noticed through press stuff that he was also someone who was incredibly controlling. So I also give the Steve Jobs example of media and what people ever said or did, and in doing so, by the way, one of the first org orders also to do like reprisals if you ever leaked anything or had news he didn't like. And I can tell you, one of the best examples I ever saw was I once had an incident where basically I was discussing, let's say, like something to do with one of his players. And I noticed when it was just between me and one of his players, and I was talking about something, he was incredibly rude. He was very standoffish. He even basically like disrespected me as a professional and sort of implied that, like, I was taking myself too seriously with the whole journalism thing. I would ironically say that to a journalist, by the way, but yeah, you're taking it a bit seriously with this whole journalism thing. What, you think you're a real journalist? And then here's the joke. About a year later, without saying details, he wanted to actually hire me as the head of his website. And I just noticed when that conversation was like talking to a different person, because what he did, and this just gave me the insight into who this guy is, he flipped that fucking charisma switch that only certain people have in esports. I've always said Fallen's one of them. The certain Taz is one of them. When they flip that switch, you can see why they've been so successful, because their charisma is like a social superpower. Like suddenly you feel valued by them and you feel like what they're saying is so true. And wow, they're so passionate and they really seem to get you. And when I realized was, holy fuck, this is what this guy does. The thing with this guy is it's like some sort of a fucking like superhero character where like the aura has like a distance. He has to get you in a room. If he gets you in a room and you sat in front of him and he can look you one-on-one and talk to you, he'll get the tractor beam on you, mate. It'll work. And all I'll say is this. I think actually the shrewdest thing Alex Garfield ever did compared to every other org owner is every other org owner on some level still didn't understand how media and sponsorships work and still thought that your best chance to get money as an org is for the player to win the world championship. Whereas Alex Garfield was smart enough to know, look, you try to win the world championship if you've got the best players, but the actual best thing you can do is make your players stars, whether they're last place or first. And so one of his things, you'll know this, Monty, is he was one of the first people ever to demand that every top player hit their streaming hours. He would structure your contract that way. You know my boy Naniwa, who was mates with me. Naniwa would complain publicly that, they're fucking finding my salary. And I would tell him, it's in your contract that you have to do X amount of hours a week, you idiot. And you didn't do it. And he'd be telling me, my mate, like, but I came fourth at the MLG. And I was like, they don't care. I said, Alex Garfield doesn't give a monkeys about that, mate. I said, you could have won that MLG. He wants you to hit the 40 hours streaming or whatever it was per week. Obviously, it would be 40, maybe a month, 40 a month, right? The reason he wants you to hit that, mate, is because that's what he's selling to the sponsor. He's not selling you coming fourth at MLG. He's selling that he will guarantee a famous player like Naniwa, a famous player like Hawk, a famous player like Idra, Jaedong, they will be on stream at these times with your sponsor brand, and they will be playing even in EG sponsored. There's another thing he pioneered, by the way. This is how smart Alex Garfield is, right? Alex Garfield realized that, we all make fun of grifters where they'll take like a fake esports accomplishment and pretend it's something massive. People don't know that orcs did that for like 10 plus years. So what Alex Garfield realized is, when we all made fun of Nicole Point Jameson for going on that interview recently, and the graphic came up and it said they'd won like, I don't know, 118 tournaments or something, and we all laugh. The joke is Alex Garfield's the reason the numbers pumped up, guys, because he figured out quite early on, wait a minute, if actually I have Idra and Huck, but they don't win MLG, well, the guy who's at this fucking like generalized sponsor for Lifestyle brand, he doesn't even know what MLG is. So why don't I just have 4 competitions that are by my sponsor that's an 8-player cup, where it's like Idra, Huck, and then 3 players from Complexity and then 1 guy from Vortex Gaming or something. And then basically when then Idra wins that, I go, another cup for EG from Idra. And then the joke is you just sex it up, don't you? So this guy basically understood media and what fucking sponsors want. And that is no mean feat, by the way, because when we're talking now, like, remember, you always have to put people in their era. Whoever's like second place in this discussion is miles behind. Like, I don't even know who would be second place is the joke. Like, this is before, remember, the Reggies and TSM and the FaZe people. Like, the joke is this guy really was just light years ahead of some of this shit. That's why in some ways he got to be a bit Machiavellian with it too, because he just had that power.
Yeah. And just to again kind of like another area that they were like so far ahead. The news, and this is speaking from a journalistic perspective, which was kind of again, most of my work at that time period, if not all of it in esports. They were so Evil Geniuses was so fucking vicious when it came to access. Like, if you had ever written anything, like Alex absorbed it all. Like, he knew everything that you'd ever written, ever said. And yeah, he was very derisory of journalists. What he said to Duncan about why are you taking this so seriously, he said it to me as well. Like he couldn't understand why I would want to be inflexible on journalistic ethics. I guess, what I would say about Alex there is, I mean, because I know obviously from talking to him now in the modern era, we're all adults and, we put all of this silly nonsense aside. He does have a huge respect for what I do, but obviously less so when it was raining on his fucking parade, right? And he was incapable of sort of seeing, it's like you got to do everyone. I can't just give you a pass because you're evil geniuses. He sort of never got that concept. But I mean, I'm sure this happened. I'm sure this applied to you. I got blacklisted by EG definitely at least twice, and it took a long time to sort of mend defenses. I couldn't interview them when I went to events. It was made abundantly clear, and Alex was on fucking speed dial for these decisions because there were a couple of events I went to. I thought I'll just chance it, like they're not gonna know. If you get the right manager. I know what you mean,
Richard. When you would ask, this is one of the only teams ever, I'm sure you can confirm this. Back in the day, maybe if the player's been told in advance he can't do the interview, you might say, I can't do it. But I know what you're talking about. This was the only team.
Used to call him up.
You would have to ask the player. They would go to the player manager, who might even the joke be like someone we were going to invite on this show. They would go, I'll contact them. And then they'd come back to you like half an hour later, like you're saying, and say basically yes or no. And sometimes it was no, which is like no team operated that way back then. That's how you know what you say. It must have just been like Howard Hughes style, a direct line, like, do you say yes or no, sir? And then he tells them,
he used to brief the manager. He used to brief the managers, no media work unless it's cleared by me. And so anyway, like I got blacklisted on more than one occasion where he just told.
And a lot of times EG would blacklist people for dropping roster news because that was the thing. I was getting to
the famous Slasher example. Obviously, this was another thing. This is 2012, so we're all over a bit with the timeline here, but whatever. It's like we say, it's an oral history, a series of anecdotes to make you understand the ruthless efficiency of evil geniuses, the Alex Garfield story, how they rose.
When it was even an applicable name too, by the way. At the time, actually, the name was a wasn't it? Yeah.
Bro, absolutely. So, I mean, obviously the big famous one was Slasher had leaked a roster move. Which player was it?
Here's the thing. I'm almost certain because here's the problem.
Jaedong move, right?
We talked about this before, so I think we got it the wrong way around, though, Richard, because I said it was Jaedong, but I think it was Hawk, because I believe Hawk went before Jaedong, and I think, I'm not sure, but you can look this up, but I think it was like maybe that he leaked the Hawk one, but then in doing so, Alex Garfield got mad, and so later they made a deal, and he was allowed to like jointly release the Jaedong. I might have that the wrong way around.
Yeah, maybe.
Something like that. I remember, because I know at one point later, the Joker Slasher, I think, did work with him for an exclusive interview or something. So I can't remember what the one was, but the point is, yes, when Slasher broke like a giant roster move, the joke is, unironically, this is aged so poorly, Alex Garfield did sort of just say publicly, like, well, now you've just ruined my big announcement. Which I have to say, Richard, even back then, I was like, smallest violin in the world, you fucking cunt. I don't work for you. Why would I care about your big... What? And by the way, this is how bad esports was. You remember this, Richard? Not only, first of all, were people who, yes, now they're gone and we love them, etc., like in Control, people who have a massive conflict of interest, they would just themselves be weighing in like, yeah, I actually think journalists shouldn't do that. You should sort of just let us do everything. Like, the joke was he was like winning this media award. Do you remember this, Richard?
Yeah, no, of course. So I remember exactly. So, what he said was that basically Slasher was essentially taking food off their table by leaking it. He said it was the act of leaking roster moves and other announcements like that could kill businesses. It could get rid of sponsors. It was like he was talking about it like it was this cataclysmic practice. And this is the other hilarious part. And this is why, again, Alex Garfield was a fucking evil genius, because where did StarCraft people get their news from if it wasn't fucking Slasher leaking it or a post on Team Liquid? Where did you go? Well, you went on the podcast, which was Inside the Game with DJ Wheat and In Control, right? And Whose podcast was
State
that,
of
by
the
the
Game, you
way?
mean, right? State of the Game.
So was it State of the Game?
Was it not called
State of the Game? Was JP's? It was
State of
JP's
the Game
podcast.
was JP. Inside the Game was DJ
Oh, right,
Weeks.
fair enough. Okay, maybe it wasn't. Okay.
So anyway, who sponsored that? Oh, it was Evil Geniuses. And so there was basically, if you wanted to kind of even get a response out in the kind of like, media sphere, you were ultimately having to play ball with Alex Garfield. In fact, on that, on Inside the Game, there is an episode where Slasher and Alex Garfield had a head-to-head Frost Nixon-esque debate, refereed by DJ Wheat, I think, who obviously is at that point in time, love you, Marcus, a paid shill, right? So, and like you said, because Slasher was considered an arsehole, and Alex Garfield was considered whiny.
I will say Slasher was the premier journalist at the time in esports, especially brand-wise. He was
so obviously he was universally despised, like you always are when you get to that period. Yeah, so basically they went and had that debate, and it was like a split, man. It wasn't that people just went, journalists have to leak stuff. It's kind of what they do. It's kind of their raison d'etre, and he doesn't have to care about your bottom line at all. He's got a duty to the public. Some people went that way, but you would be amazed how many went the other way, going, crazy. I mean, what value does it even add leaking stuff ahead of time and all of this? And so EG were kind of like so influential in the media sphere at that time that they were even winning people round to subverting what journalism is and was. Now they Slasher and Alex go on to bury the hatchet. They buried it in like 2015. I think Alex publicly apologized and said, I was just totally way off on that one, but win some, you lose some, I guess. But obviously at the time it was a real big deal. And in fact,
like, a massive team all going to say stuff like that after, I know Checks Notes besmirching your actual integrity and whole reputation.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know what? Maybe we just call this one a truce, and you stop doing what you're doing, nothing except legit stuff, and I'll stop doing what I'm doing, being a massive prick, lying about your name. Even fair's fair, because sadly that is just esports. You actually have to. Those are wins when you get the handshake on that. Believe it or not.
Yeah, exactly. And so anyway, like there was. It was just so hard to ever get any negative story about EG out there, even to begin with, even to just leak something that's totally benign. It's not bad if you leak a player's in there. It has no negative effect. I mean, you still get to do your announcement, by the way. But one of the biggest
myths of all time is the notion that they don't click your announcement if you did it before, don't they? It's nonsense. You get a double dip.
You get to double dip on it. Yeah, so, and I know because I've seen the numbers for both.
Of course.
So, anyway, and just as another example, and then obviously Monty, you can jump in. But I mean, just as another example for how insane his attention to detail about media messaging was. Obviously, I was quite friendly with In Control. We got pretty close because I was doing a lot of StarCraft events, and he was like a real good guy to have in the green room. In 2015, 2014 and 2015 were like fucked up years for me. And he was a good dude. Giving me a bunch of pep talks, and so we would like hang out at like Take TV events or whatever. Now, keep in mind, Take TV is a fun event where you went to a house in Crefeld and you got above a bar and you got drunk and you watched a tournament unfold while sitting on a couch, and Too Good would say outrageous things that of course, totally cancelable in this day and age. And everybody had a good time and everybody laughed. Now, surely at a Take TV event, you absolutely allow people to be frivolous. Well, no. I mean, right, EG famously was sponsored by Monster. In Control went and sat on the sofa. Somebody's drinking a Red Bull. Boom.
Not even him. It's just someone else. Yeah.
He pulled him. He pulled him because you've got Jeff, in shot with a fucking Red Bull. So he said, you can't go on the couch no more. And if you do any media work, I want it run through me. There was another weird one where obviously when you're doing these Take TV events, they're quite long. They last like, 3, 4, it's a long weekend essentially. They last a while. And so Jeff had got like, 2 or 3 jerseys. And by day 5, he's like, I'm sweating in these a lot. They smell. So I just want to wear a normal t-shirt. Again, Alex called him up. This happened in front of me. Like Alex was on the phone. Why are you walking past camera without wearing an EG jersey? Now you have to understand. Let me also just really underscore like the madness of Alex Garfield. He loved Jeff. He considered them friends.
Yeah.
He was devastated when Jeff passed. But that's business. And that's how he conducted his. So, I mean, this guy was on some other shit back then. Like you people can't conceive. Like this guy, attention to detail on everything, messaging in the media, making sure you could never risk a sponsor over something trivial. And as we'll get to in a little bit, I've got another couple of stories that are ultimately funny, I guess, in the long run. But he was ahead of the curve on influencer culture and the art of the public apology. Like we all do them now without thinking, because obviously, like, you know, people just like to fuck with each other's shit and cancel people for shit they said years ago and apologize for.
I'm glad we're going to bring this up. We'll go to the Orb story and stuff later.
Of course, yeah. Sure. But anyway, he was also the king of the mea culpa, the public apology, and managing the PR offensive. Like this guy, basically, like when he rolled his character, he just had fucking max stats in like pretty much everything you needed to be successful in esports. But obviously, as well, was like
empathy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, including evil.
In case you're wondering, we're not hogging the mic here, guys. You have to understand, me and Richard actually were doing all these things we're talking about in esports. Monty's actual contribution to esports was just hearing the phrase, "We need more gold," over and over again at the time. Technically, he'd already begun doing some like casting and stuff for Freak back in the day, right?
Yeah. I mean, I started casting. I was mostly in the Warcraft 3 scene, you know, starting in 2004. So obviously, like this started. Okay, I will also say that I dropped out of being active in esports for a couple of years while I was in college. So kind of, I was not really present or around from like 2007 until 2009, and that's where I started to get back into it again, because I was finishing up my last 2 years of university. And even though I was active in my first couple of years of university, because I was still managing Verge's Warcraft 3 team, and I was still like actively casting when I was in college, I went to Ireland in my junior year, and so I was still watching esports. So for example, I was watching in 2007, that's when the GOM TV a Veritech Intel Classic. Tasteless, and now my wife Susie were casting that. I was watching that when I lived in Ireland. So I was still very aware of what was going on, but I didn't start actively getting back into esports until like 2009.
By the way, you know, people don't even get that, Monty. They don't even know the W's Monty's actually taken. So you have to understand, I won't say some of the other names, but in this era, there were no women in esports, you idiot. Like every person was not only a man, they were a sweaty fucking nerd with bad social hygiene, no understanding of how to fucking behave. And so there were only a few women. And the joke is almost everyone, just like these women were like goddesses from heaven. You have to understand, especially if people like Lil Susie or even Smix with the game, they actually knew the game. There were people from the game. They weren't just like some person who was like, I want to be an actress or a singer, and then they just happened to come into esports. So I worked for the BBC. They were actually real people from our scene. And so the joke is, there were a million nerds. The joke is these were the faces that launched a million nerds and fucking dreams. And Monty actually got to fucking marry one of them. He actually went to the country she was in, became the biggest name in casting, like a fucking movie, and then pivoted, like parlayed that into actually marrying her. And the joke is, when he married her, he was bigger, so she thought she was getting the better end of the deal by marrying him. That's gangster right there, motherfucker. That's gangster. Understand the level of gangster we're talking about.
It was just funny because the first time I met her was 5 years after I had watched her myself. So I knew who she was. It was pretty funny. But yeah, so basically I want to go back and talk a little bit about the kind of rise of the really popular era of EG, which is the post CGS era, because people need to understand the concept of how big EG was. And it was really vibes about EG, because you guys are all talking about, you know, oh, here's the technical elements of it. But you have to understand that there wasn't a bigger NA organization at that point in time, because Complexity and 3D had kind of, you know, tied up with CGS and had gotten like hamstrung on the way out of that, as we discussed previously. People will think about Team Liquid, but Team Liquid at this time was a European org, right? This was pre Steve Aronset, the merger with Curse. So it was really just Victor in the Netherlands.
It was way smaller, man.
Yeah. And they were Team Liquid was the hub of StarCraft and esports discussion. It was mostly
the HOTV.org of StarCraft, essentially, if you know the reference.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a forum, guys. And so, yes, they controlled a lot of the journalism because their articles were really important. And everybody who was involved in RTS back in the day was on, Team Liquid. WC Replays was the other site that was used very heavily back in the day. That was on the Warcraft 3 side. And Warcraft 3 was always a smaller game than Brood War and StarCraft 2. So it was really, a center of discussion and news posting at the time, but and they had a lot of players and they did have sponsors, but they were based out of Europe, so they were not yet like the kind of North American brand that more.
There was also way less money. That's the other thing we didn't say, to be fair. It wasn't that because I guess this is the part we missed earlier on when I said earlier that this was like the North American brand. Well, obviously the joke is now sometimes North America in some games is obviously the worst region than Europe. Like the money in North America at the time, guys, might have been 10 times what it was in Europe. So the other thing is, by being number one North America, he was de facto number one in the world, that meant. And at the time, by the way, like Korea and China were their own thing. So, like, actually, it was enormous. Like, the joke is, as you're saying, people like Team Liquid were tiny compared to EG, even though they were big in Europe. Even the SK Gamings, we didn't have the money, I can tell you from behind the scenes. We couldn't pay our StarCraft players what they paid. They were offering, they were doing essentially what Immortals did later with LCS. They were just offering people 2 and 3 times more money just so you signed.
Yeah, and also, Team Liquid did make, I think, some good money at the time because they had a lot of web traffic, and this was before web advertising.
Oh, sure. Yes.
Web ads sucked ass in terms of, back in the day, it was easier to get money from running web ads, which is why, we saw things like, the other coverage sites like GotFrag actually doing very well because this was before advertising rates for your website crashed into the dirt that they are right now.
I can tell you, I worked for one of these sites. When I worked for SK Gaming, and we were one of the biggest sites in the world, every month we used to make, millions of views. And that, at the time, before the subprime mortgage shit, even around that time, you could still make decent money off that. They could actually pay you for the ads for that. Yeah, for real.
Yeah, so TL was a big site and had a lot of traffic. And so I know they were doing some pretty decent revenue back in the day, compared to their peers. And it's not a huge, obviously, probably multi-million-dollar effort, but they were paying people. They were paying their staff, and it was a coveted place to work at the time, especially as a journalist, because you could go full-time back in the day. But what really, I think, triggered the rise of EG was, in the kind of EG powerhouse period, it was really, they signed some players for including In Control, I believe, during the Brood War era, and then transitioned into StarCraft 2 later on. And StarCraft 2, there was a lot going on during this period, guys, but the rise of StarCraft 2 was very closely aligned to the rise of live streaming services like Own3D and Twitch, and this is where League of Legends started to get super huge as well. But there wasn't a difference back in the day, really, between the pro players and the big streamers, right? And that's why we saw such huge numbers in the early days of League of Legends, particularly the LCS, because the professional players that were playing in the early stages of LoL were the biggest streamers, like Hotshot and The Odd One, and these guys, they were the big streamers. And this was true of StarCraft as well, is that the personalities were absolutely enormous. And we could go back now and look at a lot of the podcasts from that era that were about StarCraft. And you look at State of the Game or Inside the Game or Live on 3, which was an industry podcast, but still a lot about StarCraft. And these podcasts, you can go look at JP's State of the Game VODs, and you'll see that they were doing 40, 50,000 YouTube views. And that was like 12 years ago, guys. That was like 12, 13 years ago. So imagine.
Remember, YouTube itself wasn't even out that long. It'd only been out a few years at this time. So you've done the biggest show on the whole platform at the time, for real. Yeah.
Yeah. And like everybody was super invested in the personalities of the scene, and In Control and Idra and these guys, Huck, that were a part of EG, were enormous personalities on these shows. In Control was literally just one of the hosts of Inside the Game and State of the Game. So there was a lot of opportunities to get value out of EG personalities and sponsorships. And Thorin, you mentioned this earlier, but this was also how Alex ran the team, which is you are going to stream for X number of hours because this is a deliverable that we're going to send to our sponsors. You are going to live in the EG house. And this was very famous. So in Phoenix, in Arizona, is where the EG house was. And this was seen as very prestigious. Like, it seems hilarious now that you would want to live in this gaming house, but it was the mystique of EG was that they had, the branded monster fridges behind them, and it looked cool and it looked clean, and like anytime you could tune into one of the player streams and you could see if you were watching In Control stream, you could see Idra in the background of the stream on another computer, right? And so there were these constant interactions between the professional players, and it felt like you were there in the house, right? So not only were they like pillars of these podcasts, not only were they streaming themselves, but there was this whole environment around EG that was just fucking cool.
I remember
at the time.
drama when Total Biscuit just said it's a glorified frat house.
Yes.
And because obviously they weren't performing at tournaments, and you would tune in, you would see Idra fucking raging and all that, and John being John just said, like, it's a glorified frat house. That's all it is. There's no like performance aspect to it. It doesn't help. And obviously, this like that was another example of like, well, Alex wasn't going to tolerate that. That was a weird little beef that last. I mean, they squashed that pretty quick because John was so fucking big and obviously was doing StarCraft commentary as well and making StarCraft videos. Alex obviously went a little easier on him, but I mean, like, John was one of the biggest, if not the biggest, fucking gaming YouTuber at the time, and Alex was willing to butt heads with him over that.
People don't even know, but like the lol emote that you guys all use on Twitch is John, right? And he was super famous not only as a YouTuber, but he was very active as a caster in StarCraft. That's how I met him at an MLG for the first time. But he was one of the biggest figures in gaming, and he was pushing a lot of his influence onto the professional StarCraft scene, and even later on running a team at a loss. But he wasn't wrong about it being a frat house, but that was the appeal, guys. And like there was just this, you just have to describe the energy that surrounded EG at the time, where like when they did something, it was just big news, right? When they signed Huck, it was fucking big news.
That was huge.
And the thing about EG2 is that they were constantly like hitting on the right games. And I think that's another thing that Alex deserves credit for, is that a lot of orgs kind of dropped the ball at not getting into certain games, but they got into Dota well before Dota 2 was even released and then became a very famous Dota org. They rode the StarCraft wave to massive popularity very early on. When Team Liquid was basically being like, we don't really care about League of Legends, EG was like getting in there and trying to sign, good players, and had an LCS team in the early days of LCS, when it was still operated by, the kind of the Alex Garfield empire of EG before they sold to Twitch. So there's a lot of forethought there to get into the right games and to use their brand strategically in order to kind of keep being relevant. And a big part of that, and it makes sense later on why Alex Garfield eventually got involved with companies like Loaded, the influencer agency that reps Ninja during his peak and reps like a bunch of the other most famous streamers in the world, because this was a natural extension of what he was already doing. Because at the time, there was no difference between professional esports players and influencers. They were the fucking same thing in like 2009 through 2016, maybe, right?
Yeah, but also it's not just the games. Like it's the players within the games, and sometimes like not even players. There was one thing, because like Duncan gets this, because Duncan is a purist about excellence. So if Duncan was a GM at an org, I imagine things like reach and how presentable they are on camera, and could they go and do some live commentary or work as an analyst or make a really compelling YouTube video. I think they're all secondary concerns to Duncan, if not tertiary concerns. I think Duncan would pick players based on how well they can play the motherfucking game. But that wasn't the primary reason EG made the pickups they made. Like, you're talking about the Hook one there. I mean, crucially, Hook was just this, beloved, player who'd been at Team Liquid all his time. People thought he was going to be like a lifer at Team Liquid. He was, likable guy on camera, outgoing. I mean, you wouldn't make a claim to say like Hook was like, the Koreans weren't in any danger with he. Like, not as I recall.
Well, he did win that MLG in Orlando, but yeah.
I mean, come on, right? Like, so you know what I mean? But like, ultimately, Alex didn't want, in the era of live streaming, he didn't want to go and maybe have the slightly more opaque, insular Korean culture, to get him the trophies, and then that was that. No. He wanted guys who had personality. He wanted guys that would be able to go on a live stream and hit those deliverables and be compelling and do a podcast, which was another deliverable, and all this other stuff. And so if you look at the signings throughout all of the games, it's not just StarCraft. They had people like Grubby was at EG, for fuck's sake. They had Grubby. They had Justin Wong.
Yes. I mean, they had a bunch of during that era.
Like K-Brad, Tasteless was at this org, for fuck's sake. Like, you don't, I mean, again, like, listen, obviously, me and the FGC, like the average FGC fan can go fuck themselves. But I really like a lot of the competitors because of the time, when I was doing E-League, I got to meet them. And, when Daigo Umehara got put into the Hall of Fame, he specifically asked for me to read out the thing in the Esports Awards, which blew me away. Like, I had a pleasure of meeting him like one time, and so that was kind of great. But I mean, like, those FGC guys, some of those dudes were fucking just insane personalities, great on camera, really carried it. And I would even go so far as to say that EG, and through things like Live on 3 and DJ Wheat's interests, they really popularized the idea of esports orgs having FGC representation, as just part and parcel of the deal. Not a specialist org, not an org that only does FGC, but they went out and they got competitors at a time when people probably were like, it's not really a lot of return in having an FGC guy, and they went out there and got the biggest personalities, all of them across the board. So it's like there was a specific archetype of what you had to have to be at EG. And it was, you had to be someone that could go on camera. And if you could win as well, great. But that was by no means, that was by no means the priority.
By the way, I have a good pivot from that, because this actually leads into some of the stuff that you were referencing earlier about how very interestingly characterized the media angle of it was. Because here's what's interesting, like Richard says, one of the reasons people often mocked this team, and by the way, speaking of vibe and atmosphere, this team was absolutely the TSM of their day, or maybe EG nowadays, where if you say something negative, you will be blacklisted publicly and or privately, and it will, and the whole premise goes that as a result, you get the conspiracy of silence, where even pros don't sometimes speak out when they think there's issues. So first of all, that very much was present. And then also, if you look at how they dealt with it, like Richard says, they would have people in their org who were never, ever going to make a podium of an MLG, no matter how bad the players were. Like, I'll give you two examples. So they had a guy that was one of their first people in StarCraft, that guy called Machine, the one called like Bryce, whatever his name was. Yep. This guy, like, the joke is, the only way he could have won is like my old meme from analyst desks, where when people would be desperate as a host and they would go, well, is there any way the underdog would win? And I would go, yes, you could have a voodoo curse on the enemy. You could hope that God strikes them with lightning. The joke is, he would actually have needed these things to happen to ever win a tournament. This guy, when I said earlier, they would make up their own sponsored like 8-man tournaments. The joke is, he wouldn't win those, for fuck's sake. But because he was a guy who was just a loyal soldier and just kept his head down and did his deliverables and did his hours and was in that team house practicing with Idra and Hook and in control, he got paid. And by the way, go look how long he was in AG for, a long time. Then how about when they signed DeMuslim? Remember, DeMuslim at one point was going to be a very promising player. Never made it. If you ever go look at his career, he has fuck all accomplishments. But he was in AG for like 4 or 5 years, guys. Even though at the time, as far as I know, he was actually in one of those nightmare scenarios where I think he had like visa issues and all sorts of shit. I think he maybe even had some health issues. Who knows? But anyway, because whereas the Machine guy was just doing the job of like doing the basics, the Muslim guy, fabulous on camera, great person for media work. Have him in a skit shit even, very loved by the community. Alex Garfield was incredibly loyal to these people, and unironically, I think almost nepotistically, paid these people very, very handsomely for being quite average at the fucking game. But here's the difference. This is where you know this guy didn't do it out of pure sentiment, like Richard said earlier, because Idra was this guy's fucking boy. You have to understand that. He fucking loved Idra. Like, I actually think for real, he had like an actual personal affection for him that went way beyond this is like a talented player or like a pro. I think he actually cared about this guy. And if people don't know, he not only had to battle down many ridiculous incidents of Idra that weren't just WWE kayfabe, like, lol, he's just doing it for the cameras. But famously, when Idra literally went onto the main subreddit forum back in the Team Liquid, which, as Monty said, was the main way to communicate with fans of the community, and told fans openly that I get paid to treat you like a piece of shit, and I love it, because that's basically the most obnoxious and offensive thing you could say in a professional sponsored org. Alex Garfield had this guy fired. Now, behind the scenes, he did do stuff like pay his rent and help his transition. But the point I'm making is this: that's one of his main guys, dudes. That's one of his guys that in theory, you would, in theory, any other org would go to the hilt to keep that person and make any excuse. But actually, the point I'm making is when Alex Garfield knew, I can't defend this behavior, this is actually inexcusable, and even worse, he hasn't done it where it's just like an insult. He's gone out of his way to insult our fans. Like, he knew I had to fire this guy, and I'll leave it open if Richard wants to tell the story. But I actually think that Orb one's an even better one, because famously, to me, the joke is, Richard, I do remember the incident because I'm Thorin, but the actual Orb incident itself should just be a footnote in history. Alex Garfield's response to it is mental. Like, that basically, it's almost like a fucking thesis from like a political undergrad or something. Like, it was wild.
It's crazy. I've got it in front of me. I pulled it. I'll just add on to the Idra thing again.
Yeah, do it.
You know, it was like, I remember writing opinion pieces because obviously by now I'm the StarCraft journalist, right? I'm the guy that calls out Pizza GG. I'm the guy that called out the Sons of StarCraft documentary. Yep. I'm getting hired to be host, for some of the events. And so obviously, I had a lot of goodwill from StarCraft fans initially. It wasn't until our appearance on Unfiltered when we said basically WCS was dead in the water and Blizzard had fucked it up that the StarCraft fans turned on me. They always
I appreciate that there's only one ever episode of a series called Unfiltered Esports, Monty, because there was no such thing as Unfiltered Esports. What actually happened is Chanman was like, will you come on Unfiltered? And I was like, well, I'm not coming on with Destiny's there. So he's like, it's okay because I'm creating a new series called Unfiltered Esports. But the joke is, episode 1 was just me and Richard saying everything that's true, like Emperor's fucking new clothes style, to the side. And it was so unpopular, there never was another episode. And I don't think I've ever done a show. Like, that was just the one. It was like the one and done, just died on its ass completely.
He basically made a spin-off just so Destiny wouldn't get fucking tilted.
I love it.
We killed the spin-off after one episode. I know. By being too harsh. So
I love it.
So anyway, I remember writing an op-ed about the Idra thing, saying it's absolutely so out of pocket that Alex has cut him. And again, the statement that they put out was this. Let me just read it. He says, there's no easy way to say this, so I'm just going to say it. After having him on our roster for nearly 3 years, we've decided to release Idra from the Evil Geniuses StarCraft 2 team. To state the obvious, this was a very difficult decision for us. Over the past several years, we as an organization have grown close to Greg, and we have developed a deep appreciation and respect for him as a person. We consider him a member of our family, and parting ways with him leaves us all with a very heavy feeling in our stomachs. There's a paragraph about how they're a player-first organization. See, guys, I'm not blowing smoke up your ass. And then he goes, as most of you are already aware, we let our players be themselves. We believe that our industry's diverse assortment of vibrant personalities plays a huge part in helping make esports so much fun for ourselves and for the viewers. No great novel is without great characters, and we like to let our players find their own roles within the esports storyline by showcasing the personalities they were born with.
That's a bag of statement so far, by the way. He's killing it. Yeah.
This is Alex Garfield again. This is what I mean about being a media master. Like, it's fucking insane. I mean, less so on the Orb story as we'll get
No,
to.
but you think how much better this is than some of the shit we get in Counter-Strike now, mate? It's mental.
I know,
It's
it's
really
wild,
good.
isn't it?
It's like 10 years ago.
So ahead of his time. We have strict guidelines that regulate certain kinds of more extreme speech, and we take disciplinary action when those guidelines aren't followed. But for the most part, we stay out of the way. That is why it was never an issue for us that Greg can be rude to opponents in games, or that he usually speaks his mind very bluntly and directly. But to us, there is a very big difference between a player being disrespectful to an opponent in a ladder match and a player being disrespectful to the entire community of people who, via their own enthusiasm and passion for the entertainment product he creates, actually make his profession possible. And so there it is. The crux of the matter was he went against the fans, and Alex knew, because trust me, there's one thing you can't do in esports. You can't tell the fans they're dickheads, even though they are dickheads. You can't tell them they're plebs, even though they're plebs.
I mean,
You
we
can't
do
tell
that.
them-
Obviously, that is the joke. Is that's our anti-brand, but it is anti-market. I agree. It is.
But this is the thing. I don't have to parlay into sponsorship.
Exactly. True.
Basically, all the other people that know esports fans are dickheads, they're my fans. So yeah, we're not many of us, but we get to feel superior and smug because we're right. So isn't that great? Come along. Anyway, so that is why you can't do it. He knew that, and he knew it was going to be a problem with sponsors. He knew it was going to be a problem with the community. The funny thing is, out of everything Idra had ever done, this is what the final straw was for the
wild,
community. How dare he correctly state he can talk down to me, a peon? Like, it was unreal. So anyway, the people were calling for his head, and Alex fucking served it up, man.
Yeah, it's big.
Because it was good for business. And then obviously now we get to the other example. So listen, I won't bore you with the details of the incident because, as Duncan says, it's just, it's one of those things that I'm almost loath to bring up because I do believe people should be allowed to move on from things. And I don't even know if this guy still works in esports or whatever.
I actually do think this is one of the most unfair ones as well, Richard, because you'll know this. The details of the story is this guy didn't even do the thing while he was in EG. That's the worst thing. They just found out and then later fired him because after the fact they found out he did it, right? Yeah.
Basically, he'd, for some reason, and I don't know why, it's that everyone talks about Call of Duty lobbies and how racist they're supposed to be. StarCraft ladder matches were ridiculous.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
The things people would type on a screen, like which could be screenshot. I think even in the demo file, right? The chat. Does it preserve it?
I believe it saves it. Yes,
it does save it. Yep.
So it's there forever, guys. Like, what are you doing? But people,
by the way, remember, it's not a game where you type back and forth. You just play the game. But you're right. At the end, 1 second before the guy wins, type GG. The other guy would just type, "I hope your mum dies of cancer." Like, and you're like, what? Just because I fucking four-pulled you? What? Like,
exactly.
That was really what it's like back then. Yeah, even with pros.
But put it this way, because people would just quit as soon as it became apparent they lost. Like when someone all in with a pro brush or something, they'd just be like, right, kill yourself. And the thing is, and obviously as well, because the players were playing with a lot of Koreans on ladder, they used to use racial epithets about Koreans,
of course,
like all the time. That one word was just used. And by the way, if you've got a favorite North American StarCraft, he said it. Yeah, he said it. So anyway, Orb was a commentator that had done community commentary, and he got picked up by EG to be a community commentator for them, for their tournaments, do content for them. And basically somebody, because this is the other thing, if you've ever got a skeleton in your closet, someone somewhere has that shit saved for the day you get your first opportunity.
Usually us, but
Yeah, true. But we only do it to the worst.
Sure, we only do it Punisher style, the ones that deserve it. I agree.
Exactly. We are the Punishers. That is correct. Yes. So anyway, he basically got into EG. Somebody sent these screenshots of him saying the N word, and so they cut him. And what was interesting about this, of course, is there were other people on EG at the time that had done similar things. And in fact, I remember writing an article about, if you know Mason, the popular Dota 2 streamer, he was a stand-in for EG at one of their TIs, and he had been
came like top 4 or something. Yeah, it was a big result too. Yeah,
he'd been spamming racial epithets in pubs before that, and I wrote an article about this, which has mysteriously disappeared off the Esports Heaven website. There's Alex's reach again, no doubt, but with screenshots of him doing it. And I reached out to Alex and said, I thought you didn't stand for this stuff. And for some reason, it was different. But anyway, so the Orbs, he cut Orb unceremoniously, and then the community were like, "Well, everyone's racist in ladder." People were bizarrely sympathetic about this. Again, it shows how much has changed in the last 12 years. But then Alex Garfield wrote a statement so insanely overblown that it haunted his reputation for like years to come. Basically, I've got it in front of me again, and I'll read it you. But he said that he was very sensitive to racism because he had an undergraduate degree in black studies.
This is like pornography to me. Keep going.
Yeah, right.
Get the sweat on.
So
going.
Yeah, so when the story went on to the Team Liquid forums, he basically came out and dropped "Hi y'all," and so I've got it in front of me. I'll read it to you.
Go on, get it.
This is how it starts. This is how bonkers this statement is. Back in 2003, a group of well-known Counter-Strike players, mostly white and Asian, decided it would be fun to masquerade as an African-American Counter-Strike team. They created fake names, used fake profile pictures, and proceeded to compete an entire season of league play while pretending to be African-American. When the players were finally exposed, the Counter-Strike community reacted to the incident with more amusement than anything else, and I, who was an avid member of the CS community at that time, was shocked and offended. I expressed my
literally shaking.
Yeah, he was. But nobody said this is years before all of this stuff.
This is ages ago, I know.
He was ahead on that as well.
He basically did the Putin interview before Putin. He was like, to explain why Orb said the N-word now in StarCraft in 2011. Well, I'm going to have to explain Counter-Strike in 2003.
I expressed my shock and disappointment in an op-ed, which was received somewhat controversially. While I was disappointed enough in the community's initial reaction to the incident, I was even more disappointed at its reaction to my comments. It was extremely disheartening to witness the cultural values, or lack thereof, being displayed by my peers. Almost 10 years later, I am a proud member of the StarCraft community, a culture which I find to be far more intelligent, conscious, and respectful than the Counter-Strike community was in 2003. And while I'm about to, what I'm about to say may be odd to hear, given that EG sponsors have been bombarded with complaints from StarCraft fans and players over the past 24 hours, I can say with complete honesty.
So we saw the real mechanism there of why it's made this whole thing.
Always.
He gives it away completely, didn't he? I know.
I can say with complete honesty.
Conscious, you mean then, Rich? It was maybe, the sponsors getting bombarded. Will you put this fucking fire out right now?
Yeah.
Of course, I know.
I can say with complete honesty and sincerity that I have never been prouder to call myself a member of the StarCraft community than I am at this moment. I'll explain why further down in this. This writes 2,000 words. I'm not reading it all. Right. But first, bear with me as I offer some context. My undergraduate degree is in Black Studies, Sociology, and Social Justice.
He said social justice.
Yeah. I've never even heard that term until Alex got 2012.
Yeah, it's just before all this shit. Yeah, it's a couple of years before.
And while I'll never claim to understand what life is like from the perspective of anyone other than a straight white guy, I'd like to think I have a pretty solid
Oh my God, he was living in the future. What the fuck?
No, it's wild, isn't it? Right? This is what I mean about being the PR master. Just, this backfired because he was 5 years ahead. If you release this now, everyone would go, wow.
Perfect.
This is the perfect response to this. Right? Yeah, no. Anyway, I'd like to think I have a pretty solid academic understanding of how race and racism function in contemporary society. My own credentials aside, I think it's really important to point out that racism today is not what it once was, not in the sense that it is in any less widespread or that it has any less of an impact on people's lives, but rather in the sense it functions very differently today compared to how it functioned 20, 30, 40 or more years ago. Now, by the way, he literally goes into a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 paragraph explanation of what racism has been historically in America.
Fucking hell.
I'm going to skip that. Anyway, and so for the record, I do want to point out I don't think Orb is a racist. As mentioned above, I think that to make such a claim would be to misunderstand the nature of what I call contemporary racism. This, of course, does not lessen the severity of his actions or the extent to which they are unacceptable and inexcusable, but it's still an important distinction to make. As also mentioned above, I think that it's possible to make a racist comment without being a card-carrying neo-Nazi. The latter is not a necessary condition of the former, and I hope that all of you will consider, whenever it is that you're done expressing your very justifiable outrage, forgiving Orb if he apologizes sufficiently. While no amount of penance will land him back at the EG broadcast desk, he's a very talented caster, and I hope he learns from this experience and eventually rebounds from the trouble he's gotten himself into. Then we fast forward to how Alex is great for a little bit, and then he said, I think we all already knew prior to this incident, the StarCraft community was one of the more mature gaming communities out there, but it's still refreshing and encouraging to see that maturity reinforced by how most of you guys have reached out over the past few days. I urge you to continue to stand up for what you think is right and help make this community a safe, comfortable space for everyone. I can say with unwavering certainty on behalf of everyone at EG that we are absolutely 100% committed to doing our part to achieve these goals. Now, I just wish you guys would also get this upset when people use the word F and then it's asterisked out T, so that we could start fighting homophobia too and show people that it, like racism, also doesn't belong.
Irony being, if you'd have had a fucking secret Big Brother spy camera inside the Evil Genius's StarCraft house, the aforementioned word would have fucking been used 1 million times. But let's just pretend. Remember, I always forget, Richard, that I have to actually Men in Black wipe my mind that in 2016, all of history never happened before that. And it's just everything from 2016 on was how the world always was. Just always was this way. Yeah,
indeed.
And if you guys are wondering about why Alex Garfield was writing this, so he went to Pomona, which is one of like the top 10 liberal arts colleges in America, and so this, as somebody who also went to a private liberal arts college, this makes absolute sense to me, and this is exactly the kind of like writing that you would expect from somebody who went to one of these schools.
By the way, to be fair, we'll also throw out there, the EG Canadian team we were talking about in the 2000s that he was involved with also did have like a rare example of an African-American, well, he's Canadian, obviously, so Canadian, African, or whatever the fuck you'd say, player, and it also had an Asian player as well. So like he also might, in that sense, have seen them actually get more slurs or something than just American players, I guess. So
yeah,
I can see there's some background to it, but the problem there is obviously, like you say, the joke is, Richard, no one watching now will ever be able to understand how alien that even language was back then. Like, like this really was like the meme back then, if people don't know, is when all the woke shit happened, people used to say famously, it's just some shit on a campus. He's doing this years before that even became public. Like, that was like a couple of years after this, and he's already come up with that frame. Because as you say, I think you've nailed it. If that came out in here's the real joke, Richard. So the irony of ironies, guys, is I actually last year revealed that an Evil Genius's CS player, when he wasn't in EG, had said a bunch of slurs, including saying one of the similar slurs to Ulrich from fucking ESL, which is funny, but still insane. And then when I brought this out, the modern EG didn't even ever publicly address this issue ever. Yep. The player himself apologized. That's it. So you can see how different it is. The joke is, what I'm implying here is, the modern day EG people weren't even on the level of Alex Garfield and know how to do a fabulously crafted mea culpa like that, where you even get to put in all your own things you want to make people think about your org, being mega woke, or we believe in these things, or we socially conscious, etc. Remember, that wasn't a thing either back then, guys. The other thing is, and this is why it's genius, you're actually getting one of the most ruthless businessmen also selling that he has some fucking heart and that he's doing it for like social reasons and that his conscience has been pricked. Even though I'll just say this, Alex, that has all the believability and credibility of when Henry VIII used to say his conscience was pricked, that maybe his past marriage wasn't legit because he wanted to marry someone else now. Like, it's about as believable as that. But even so, I will say, I agree with Richard. If you brought that statement out today, it would be considered fucking a 10 out of 10. Like, that would be like taught in classes of like how to do a PR statement if someone fucks up in your org. Even in this case, when they didn't do something in your org, even when it was in the past, like it's actually a masterclass. I agree.
Yeah, and look, what I'll say is, like, consistently, and history won't sort of remember this, but it is true. The rules were bent every time it could behoove EG. Awesome. They didn't have any thoughts about the Mason issue. I mean, Idra had certainly used again, insulting
easily
epithets.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, it was what the StarCraft I mean, you guys can look up a million examples of this was the RTS scene back in the day. This was inappropriate, but it was also commonplace. I mean, just go back and look at Destiny's old shit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I remember it was Quantic that cut Destiny.
Yes. Yeah, that was it.
And again, I remember it was weird that me and Steven, we ended up falling out years later. Obviously, we're all well made up now, of course. There's no point holding on to that stuff. But from 2016, but like, I was a guy that basically I wrote an op-ed essentially defending him, which probably has aged terribly in retrospect, but sort of because it was like, listen, if we're going to punish this guy for this, and this is a guy who openly, this was when Stephen was starting to get interested in politics. And so he was talking about things that were like, advocacy and clearly wasn't a bigot, but had used the no words, and so as a result, ended up getting done. I remember writing an op-ed basically saying, look, these are the actions. This is what he thinks. This is, an incident of rage using a word that obviously, is very offensive and potentially hurtful. But yeah, it was quite commonplace, I want to say, in StarCraft that you would get these dramas where it would just be, every time it was the same mechanism. It would just be a screenshot of someone in ladder, and it would just be on Reddit. And it would just be like, somebody just played this famous StarCraft player, and he told me to die, he called me the N-word, and you're just like, well, it's another fucking day with a Y in it. It was just happening all the time. It's super weird that like Alex was saying that in his statement, that going, yeah, I love the StarCraft community, so mature, and then it's like you look at
definitely not, by the way.
Yeah, you look at the discourse that was going on ladder between the pros and stuff, and all the dramas that happened, and the outrageous out of pocket shit people would say on podcasts and streams. It was like, it definitely, I mean, maybe the fans were sensible. None of the fucking competitors were. You know what I mean?
So I think this is a good time that now we've kind of fleshed out the aura and mystique of EG to talk about the transition to Twitch, because that's kind of the next major chapter in this story. And it takes some context. So basically, guys, what ended up happening, what was it? 2014 was the year when the acquisition occurred?
I think it was in 2014, wasn't it? I believe it was. Yeah.
Yes. Yep.
So in 2014,
August
so this was
specifically.
Yeah, this was after EG had become part of the LCS, right? They were there in the very early seasons of the LCS before bowing out, and then like rebuying in later on, which we'll get to into the kind of peak 6 era when they purchased the franchise slot once again. But EG was huge during this time. They had a very successful Dota team that under Twitch would actually win. When they were part of Twitch, they would win the international. And you may be wondering, like, why the fuck was an esports team bought by Twitch? And also there was it was also part of what was called Good Game Agency, which was the brand that was getting sponsorship deals, right?
Or both Alliance and EG at this point, right?
Yes, we're under Good Game Agency.
Yeah.
And so this was an acquisition that Twitch had made, and Twitch didn't really think through the implications of what would happen when they acquired a team, because this is when EG and Alliance became basically the targets of every other single major esports team at the time, because all of a sudden they had massive financial backing, not only from Twitch, but from Amazon, right? Because this was post Amazon acquisition. And indeed, as I understand it, the Twitch acquisition was largely done in Amazon stock. So think about that, 2014 Amazon stock versus now Amazon stock.
If you'd hodled that to now, you'd be like richer than anyone in the history of the universe, wouldn't you? Like,
let's just say people like Alex and Scoots probably never have to work again. There are people who are very, very wealthy as a result of the deal that occurred. But effectively, Twitch wanted to acquire these teams because they thought that it would be a good part of their portfolio, and that it would be helpful to attract sponsors, especially too because of Alex's expertise in getting endemic sponsors on board. He would be a valuable asset to Twitch. But what ended up happening is that there was basically all of the other then North American teams, so TSM, Cloud9, Team Liquid, they viewed this as a massive threat and conflict of interest, because all of a sudden, remember that they are trying to make deals themselves with Twitch, and they are trying to sign players in various games. And now all of a sudden, they have to compete with Twitch to sign players and teams, because now Twitch, who is their streaming platform, who they have, these team-wide sponsorship deals with, that they're receiving money from Twitch in response to, in return for their players to be streaming on the Twitch platform exclusively. Now all of a sudden Twitch itself, who owns EG and is Amazon, remember, so a massive, massive company, is out there in the market basically trying to outbid these teams for players. So it was a very fucked up relationship, to be fair to those team owners, but they were also just outrageous in the way that they responded to this. I know you know a lot about this, Richard.
Well, so yeah, this is an interesting time for me, right? Because this was right. I heard, so this will be new information, I imagine, some of it. So right, when the Alliance thing was popping off, and the basically you had this Alliance and EG, they were meant to be operating independently, but of course they weren't. I remember like back channeling to like Valve and like other tournament operators basically saying like, you absolutely cannot allow these guys to compete. It's a huge conflict of interest. There's, we'd already had instances by this point, like League of Legends, which you'll have a better memory of, both of you guys, but I think we'd already had that Samsung Blue, Samsung White thing. We'd already had, there was a tournament, and I won't say the name of the sponsor, but basically, again, it was in League of Legends, where you got to pick your opponent, and the sponsor said to the 3 teams they sponsored, like, out of the 6, don't pick each other, because then we'll have more brand awareness if you were all to win. We don't want our sponsor, teams we sponsor eliminating each other. So we were already getting into this like fucked up nightmare, which, we're living in it now. Spoiler, guys. But back then it was just the start of a fucked up nightmare. And so I was telling everybody that would listen, like, dudes, like, this Good Game agency he set up it's bullshit. It's a front. The Alliance and EG aren't independent. They share sponsors. They share information. They share staff. So I was trying to get it so someone would definitively take a stand, and I think the only people that really did. I remember someone at Valve told them it was going to be a problem if they didn't transfer ownership and they wanted to both be at the next TI. And it was explicitly told to Alex. Anyway, so I started racking my brain, because I'm like, if no one's going to do anything, how the fuck can we stop this bullshit? And so I did what I usually do. I hit the bricks. I started looking into the law. And as Duncan will tell you, I must have something wrong with my brain, because I'll sit down with big legal books and filings and statutes, and I read legal documentation all the time from court cases, and I'm always looking for like the mechanism through which the wrongdoing can be proven retroactively. Like, you're doing it, and I know it's bullshit. I just don't know which law it breaks, or how you could, kind of engineer it so the government would take an interest or whatever. So anyway, I realized that the Good Game agency were basically operating illegally in the state of California. Because they were calling themselves I can read you the report. I reported and put this out publicly. For me, this was one of my best pieces of journalism ever, by the way, and no one cared. This is like, when people always say to me, like, what are the articles, like, you remember fondness? It's got to be like the iBuyPower investigation or the Phantom Lord stuff. No, it's actually stuff like this. I know how unbelievably hard I had to work for this, and the stakes that were involved, because like the Tfue case, this was sort of years ahead of that, but pretty much the same thing. That this talent agency law in California that we all keep fucking with, and it's got the potential to just melt esports in California, and we're still just doing it, and we've never had the court case because everyone settles every time. So I was ahead of the curve on by about 3 years, and this was how I was going to get my man. This is how I was finally going to stick it to Alex Garfield, right? Which was super important because he'd been my nemesis for a while. And now he was getting away with his conflict of interest stuff. So here it was, right? Amazon's $970 million acquisition of streaming megasite Twitch in August 2014 was a landmark moment in the burgeoning industry of esports and live streaming. Twitch followed with its own acquisition in December, buying up one of the most successful gaming talent agencies in esports, Good Game. But with that purchase, Twitch may have inadvertently put itself on uncertain footing as the intersection of esports and entertainment law has created a knotty and unprecedented legal conundrum. California, as the epicenter of the entertainment industry, has laws specifically governing the operation of talent agencies, and depending on your interpretation, Good Game may be violating some of them, and in turn, threatening the legitimacy of the contract it has therefore signed with its clients. Good Game refers to itself consistently as a talent agency and company. On its website, the company describes its client services as talent acquisition and management, and it promises to help people who want to work with the most popular, influential gamers in and around video games. We'll connect your brand with their reach, the company boasts. Twitch described its acquisition similarly. In its announcement of the purchase, Twitch called Good Game an all-in-one talent and content company focused on gaming and esports. Over the past decade, its staff of industry veterans has worked with teams, represented players, managed tournaments, created content, and brought numerous marquee advertisers into the gaming space. It appears, however, that Good Game may not even be a legally recognized talent agency. A check on the talent agency's license database for California shows no entry for Good Game. There's no evidence Good Game's CEO, Alex Garfield, who earned a bachelor's degree in sociology from Pomona College in 2008, has ever held a talent license. Under the California Talent Agencies Act, California Labor Code Section 1700, all talent agencies are required to be licensed by the state labor commissioner. Neither Garfield, Good Game, nor Twitch responded to a request for comment at publication time. If Good Game is in violation, it's technically a misdemeanor, said Matt Galzer, an entertainment lawyer at Greenberg Gluskers Entertainment Group, but no one would prosecute under this law. They could still qualify as a talent manager and do management work. It's not answerable just by knowing about their business and looking at the law, but there are additional potential consequences. Good Game's contracts with its clients could be invalidated, and some or even all of its commissions from them put at risk. And it's a super long article. There's like loads more to it, but basically that's what I did. I was like, there's no way any of this is above board. There's no way creating an agency to act as a front and then saying teams you own are the clients and almost the exclusive clients of that talent agency. There's no way that was kosher to begin with. And then when Twitch just come in,
I mean, the irony is that's what esports teams basically do these days, which is that they operate as agencies of which their professional players are the representatives for sponsorship reasons.
Yeah. So, I mean, that to me, I was like, right, I got him. All those contracts are going to have to be redone, right? Twitch is going to have to put a fucking statement out. We bought a talent agency. The California Labor Commission are going to come after fucking Twitch and everybody else. And even though it's a misdemeanor, there's probably going to be a fine. I was like, Richard's eating good tonight. Fuck all of y'all, right? But no, none of that happened. In fact, Twitch pretty much just killed the story with silence. Nobody took it seriously. The California Labor Commission didn't come looking. No lawyers picked up the case. No contracts were invalidated. And what we then ended up with was this weird fucking era, which had a huge negative impact on my life and career by a weird quirk in it. We had Twitch owning 2 esports organizations and the talent agency that represented them and all of the talent that were on the books of that agency. So All of the other orgs, the TSMs, the Cloud9s, they're like, "Heyo, hang on. Surely Twitch is going to give preferential treatment to the Twitch-owned orgs. They're going to have them on the front page more often than us. If there's a sponsorship deal or an activation, they're going to go to them first. Well, we're your partners." And so this created this insane behind-the-scenes drama, which many of the players involved in tonight to this day.
They were afraid that because of the Amazon bankroll, that they were just going to be crushed in a business sense as well. Because you guys have to understand that in 2014, again, Alex was ahead of the curve on this one. He realized, I think, something very important, which is that there was going to be big money coming into esports.
Yes.
The trajectory, it was on this fucking rocket ship at the time, guys. Like the existence of Twitch and the existence of live streaming had made esports from an extremely niche thing that the three of us were part of in the early days when live streaming didn't exist, guys, and you had to watch replays or demos, or like you had to do janky ass things in order to watch professional games. Now, all of a sudden, here was YouTube, here was Twitch, here was Own3D, right? Azubu, these other streaming services, and they were making it much more accessible and much more widespread and much more popular. And so basically there was a significant fear at this time that big companies were going to come in or professional sports owners was another one. Like, why would a professional sports owner who could absolutely destroy any esports teams in terms of bankroll without really even giving it a second thought? Like, it doesn't even cut into their bottom line. Because remember, in 2014, a player getting paid $100,000 was a lot of money. And in that era, right, a lot of money. Like the top paid players would make something like that from their orgs. So it would be really easy for any professional sports team to come in and say, like, well, we can just take over this space. Like we can just make our own team. And it would be very hard for even evil geniuses to compete in that environment if big spenders came in and wanted to do something. And basically everybody was afraid of just getting swatted like an insect. And so there was a real sense that you had to take on investment, or you had to find a professional sports owner to back you. And I think people in retrospect would say that these concerns were rather silly, because you needed the endemic knowledge in order to run the team. So it was much more likely that a partnership would be formed, which is eventually what happened. Right, guys? Like when we saw major sports teams come into the space, like the Robert Kraft, they hilariously, they ended up hiring Huck to kind of manage their team, right? And they tried to get endemic people involved. Or they would create partnerships with endemic organizations, right? Or they'd invest, a professional sports team would invest into one of the existing, esports organizations. So it ended up being kind of overblown. But he was right in that they did need to take money in order to survive, because you had to be financially competitive with, multi-billion-dollar sports teams, right? And so I think that was part of the fear. And from Twitch's side, look at their goals after this, right? Because I think Alex Garfield and GGA provided a lot of what they wanted, which was instant access to esports teams and brands. Because remember, it was the esports teams and brands were the biggest things in 2013, 2012. It wasn't individual influencers yet at this time. Those influencers were the professional players, and EG was still the crown jewel. The EG was still the crown jewel in the North American esports crown, right? Yeah. They were still the biggest org in spite of the rise of things like TSM, and they still had the most money. And they still had the most sponsors. And so Twitch was getting, was these two esports teams. But I think most importantly, they were getting Alex and his staff that were.
Yeah, they were geniuses at getting this stuff. And crucially, just sorry to cut you off, but the important thing you have to remember is by this point, we're talking early 2015 now, and obviously a little bit before that, Alex is done with the idea of just running orgs. He wants to get on to the next shit. He already knows that there is a limit to where an esports org can realistically go to. Do you know how he knows that? Because he took 2 orgs to that limit.
Yes.
He built not one but 2 successful orgs that were both like culturally distinct, had very strong brands, strong brand identity, strong sponsor synergy, and were successful. He did, like, you do understand that we think of the greats as people that do that one time, right? He did it twice with ease, right? And then he was looking at the turbocharging of live streaming at this point. The Amazon acquisition, it's the most squandered tech deal in the history of tech. Right, because they've done nothing with it, and word is behind the scenes they are actually even considering selling Twitch. You know, there's a lot of chatter from tech industry people that is a now viable path that Amazon are looking into. You know, you can decide how true you think that is, but you know, he in 2015 saw, well, influencers are coming now. This is it. This is the era of the influencer. And I want to be an agent. Yep. And I want to be part of that because that is going to be, you know, so much bigger than esports.
Sure. And also, like, I think Twitch was also interested in operating esports leagues themselves. I mean, they did operate Rocket League themselves for a number of years. Like, they were very actively trying to, you know, not only be the platform for esports, but they started to independently, they became a tournament operator and a circuit operator. And they had competitions that they wanted to run. And Alex was simply, I think, the best person to get sponsors for this. And I think Alex also thought, to your point, Richard, I can parlay my existing corporate relationships into bigger deals as the platform grows. Like, I already know all of these people. They kept re-upping with me. They trust me. They know that I run effective marketing for them. So why not just continue to grow as Twitch grows? But unfortunately, because of well, I mean, it's not, I guess it's not really unfortunately. Unfortunately for him, not necessarily unfortunately in general or for the industry, what ended up happening was the backlash by the rest of the owners was incredibly severe. And this was also a period that, I mean, it got really nasty, guys. Like, people, a lot of these other teams were just actively lying about EG and Alex Garfield and the things that they had done and the kind of people that Alex and his team was. And it was, I mean, it was outrageous because the other owners were very insecure and very jealous of Evil Geniuses because of their success. And so when they saw the opportunity here to make a big stink about this Amazon/Twitch acquisition of EG, it was, I mean, the gloves came off, guys. Like, there were tons of really gross rumors that were flying around the industry that were completely untrue about EG and the people who worked at EG. I mean, it was slanderous, right, Richard, in many ways?
Yeah. I mean, dude, you know, the key component here was, Alex had never had to deal with anyone as ruthless, if not more ruthless than him. You know, he went up against fucking teddy bears, man. So, like, Alex might be wearing the heavyweight belt, right? He might be the champ of the world. He never had to fight no Mike Tyson. You dig? Like, he was going up against puppy dogs. He was going up against, you know, Jason Lake.
Like, who is a sweetheart.
Yeah, like, and more so now than ever. I mean, like, but even back when Jason Lake was mean, it was like the stories were like, well, he shouted at me one time, and you're like, all right, okay, yeah. Did he fuck up your career and blacklist you? And, no, he didn't do any of that. No. So I mean, like, Alex got to operate in a time where his corporate ruthlessness, it was never mirrored or reciprocated. In fact, I remember distinctly back in the old days when Alex was on the come up and they were building EG prior to the Good Game acquisition, people always thought they could be allies. They always thought, like, you know, like, they used to give Alex the rising tide raises all ships speech over and over and over again, and he would just sort of like smile, and then, you know, you're getting Tywin fucking Lannister the next day. So I mean, when he met the cartel, when he met Steve Arnset, Reggie, and fucking Godfather Jack, his first time in his life, he'd ever come up against anyone that was willing to go to the same lengths, if not further, as him to get what the fuck they wanted. And they deployed every single dark art you can to fuck somebody in business and fuck somebody where they live, right? Like, you know, because he was on the he had just got to Twitch, and within a month he's on the outs because these guys, the shit they were saying, the shit they were threatening, you know, like there was even some stuff with Riot in this that one day is going to come out. Because remember, they were the heavy hitters in League. So if I do remember rightly, there was a period here where I think Brandon Beck was fucking brought in to mediate.
I don't know about this, but that's
Think
crazy.
about that. Think about that. They brought in, because it was a League of Legends thing, you know, basically what happened was Cloud9, TSM, Team Liquid, and I think CLG were even folded in at this point. Like George, though, he's not like that. Hotshot was just sort of like, can I be in the room with you guys when you're planning the evil things?
It's also that Kelby May, who ran CLG, was now part of Good Game Agency. He actually was part of this acquisition.
Yeah. It was probably Kelby
side.
It might have been Kelby who set up the thing. Because basically, so you've got CLG, you've got TSM, Cloud9, and Team Liquid, and they're all saying, like, if you keep this deal in place as it's structured now, where you own EG and you own Alliance, we can't be partners with you. You own our direct competitors, and you have the tools to give them disproportionate favors on a platform we need to do business. So fuck you if you don't,
and you have much more money than us.
Yeah, if you don't turn this around and change this, we're going to YouTube. And I think they were on the phone to Fwiz the same fucking day it was announced. They were like, listen, we'll just fuck off. We'll do one. And by the way, we'll take you to court if you try and hold us to the contracts and agreements, because we're pretty sure you just breached yours. And so that was what they were up against. So they had to go to Alex going, yeah, there's been a few complications. Now, can you imagine, right, if you're Riot Games and you're like TSM and Cloud9 and these Team Liquid, all these orgs are essential to your fucking ecosystem, as is Twitch, and you're a partner of Twitch as well, and suddenly your teams that, like, you know, you get to do all these cool little crossovers with them, you all exist in this little orbit, you've all built this little empire together, suddenly they're disgruntled and they're going to fuck off. Meanwhile, Evil Geniuses famously were no more for Dota than League of Legends. I know obviously that changed. Alliance, the same thing. So it wasn't even like, they weren't even in their world. And so obviously, yeah, that's when you bring in the Riot mediators. Like I said, I'm 99.9% sure that they were called in for the fucking sit down to try and chill everyone the fuck out. And it didn't work. And so EG suddenly were in this position where, through no fault of their own, all they've done is agree to be sold, right? Alex couldn't foresee this, and neither could Twitch.
And so the result of this was that basically Twitch had to handcuff EG and Alliance. And what I mean by that is that they had to freeze any acquisition of new rosters. So the term, basically what happened with EG was they were allowed to continue operating, but they couldn't get any rosters in games that they were not already a part of when this decision was made in, I believe, like early 2015. And any players that they needed to get in their old rosters, they actually just had to get players that nobody else wanted, because if they started to offer contracts to players that other esports teams like Liquid, Cloud9, TSM, they couldn't get into a bidding war with these teams, because the teams would go fucking mental. And basically all of them agreed that if they figured out that EG was trying to get a player that they wanted to sign, they would all just go ape shit together at Twitch. So it made it virtually impossible to run EG as an org, because they could only go after players that nobody else wanted, and only in games that they already
There was
existed
also
in.
some other shit I heard, like, where it was getting to the points of, like, you know, they didn't want Alex to negotiate for sponsors on their behalf.
Which is mental, because like that's like essentially just have the guy do the deal. That's like saying I don't want Warren Buffett to invest on my behalf.
Yeah,
like, do you like money or something?
So literally, one of the guys that we know is like a fucking solid expert in doing this thing. Their egos couldn't handle the idea if Alex had like landed them a big deal. So they said to executives, listen, he's never negotiating for us, because that was the pivot. Like Alex was going in there to be the negotiating guy for Twitch, and then when they said, "Oi, you can't have fucking two orgs," they went, "Listen, well, what about this then? He negotiates for you as well, and all these sick deals he brings in, you'll get them." Their egos couldn't handle it. They said, "Absolutely no chance. That's never happening. We negotiate our deals. We can't trust him." So even though he was completely removed from like team org ownership essentially, and was being airlifted into an executive position in what is functionally Amazon, really. I mean, yeah, it's Twitch, but it's owned by Amazon. So think about he would have been in his fucking element, but they wouldn't let him do it because, again, egos. And so this is where the problem starts. There's now nowhere to put Alex. You've brought him in to do these very specific things. I heard there was like all sorts of crazy shit, man. Like they were fucking, I mean, put it this way. The one thing they did, because I don't want to talk about some of the dirt. There's a practice, you probably heard of it. It's called monstering. Where it's like you just constantly fling shit at someone. You just say all the heinous stuff. You can't prove it, but you say it in like, transitory and ephemeral media. You just constantly imply negative stuff about people over and over and over again until people just get this vibe that they're just bad guys. Well, that's essentially what they did to Alex. And so, for example, they said the whole deal, because it was done with someone Alex had historically been close to, who now happened to work at Twitch. They said they were complaining to other Twitch executives, saying the whole deal is nepotistic nonsense, and that this could never work and it would never work for you. And why would you ever own an org? He's just done this to give his friend loads of money. And so the smear job that went on behind the scenes, and this is where, funnily enough, because remember, only in 2015, I'm reporting about this with the viewpoint, fuck Alex Garfield, right? He's breaking talent agency law. I'll use any mechanism to stop this conflict of interest bullshit. When I started hearing about what these guys were doing and how he'd been completely fucking neutered and his dream job was a nightmare inside of 4 weeks, and it looked like his position was going to be untenable at Twitch, and then the stress exacerbated his personal health and all this other stuff, suddenly I was like, actually, what these guys are doing is really fucking bad. These guys are the assholes, These are the bad dudes, and keep in mind as well. At this point, I mean, shit, we got all this VC money coming in that these guys are starting to piss up against the wall. We're not that far away from the Echo Fox thing where they fuck Rick Fox. All of a sudden, I was kind of like, yeah, I'm gonna start digging into this. Actually, I'm gonna help Alex Garfield.
Well, I think what's amazing too is that during this era in 2015 is when they won TI, right? So it's like the competitive success. It now obviously a lot of those player signings, I believe, like predated Twitch, which is why they could still be competitively successful. But they were, the brand itself was perpetuating, and it was doing very well competitively. But I know it was devastating personally to Alex that basically he couldn't, because he cared about the competitive success of the org. Like, sure, he cared about the sponsorships too, but he took a lot of pride in when EG would win trophies, and now that wasn't even possible to do anymore. And that's not why he signed this deal. He signed this deal to get stability for his org in an esports world that he thought was changing, and that he needed to make an alliance with big money in order to maintain competitiveness for the long haul. And I mean, this is basically they got frozen by Twitch. So they couldn't compete for players with other teams. They couldn't sign new players in new games. Certainly they couldn't spend money on like franchising pushes later on, even though it's kind of after they got let go by Twitch. But effectively what happened is that everybody who was part of this acquisition, who had the equity in EG that was now a Twitch employee, was just sitting there basically like twiddling their thumbs, waiting for their stock to vest, right? While working on other projects. But essentially, EG was just kind of frozen.
Well, yeah,
and left to slowly wither and die as they couldn't compete with other teams within the player marketplace.
And it's just also worth mentioning as well that, you know, the cartel, they were fucking terrified of anything, you know, going above and beyond what they were. They strategically broke up other alliances. Like, do you remember when they did that hatchet job on Chris Badawi? Right. So the hatchet job on Chris Badawi that they did, where they like basically said, "Oh, Travis Gafford just wrote uncritical, you know, secondhand versions of events," where all the owners came together to say, "Yes, Chris Badawi is dangerous to the ecosystem, not because he's a piece of shit, but because he poaches players, which we've never engaged in, of course." And I remember a time when he did this, which can't be verified, but Travis will.
It was also lies.
Yeah, it was all lies. It was all total lies. You know, I say that, I fucking can't stand that guy. But they lied about him, and Travis was the fucking facilitator for that. But do you know why they did it? And I know this because I talked with one of the people that told those lies. So, you know, one of the six, I'm not going to say who. And I asked, why did you feel compelled to tell those obvious lies to try and fuck this guy? And it was because they thought, because Chris Badawi was a bullshit artist, they thought he was financially backed by Martin Shkreli. They thought, and the person that told me this said, I am barely a millionaire. If they're backed by someone like Martin Shkreli, this is before Martin Shkreli went to prison and all that stuff. You know,
which is not true, by the way.
Right? Yeah, it never was true for a second. But like, I think Martin Shkreli had played like one game of League of Legends with him or something. Like that was about it, right? But anyway, because they were so terrified of the idea that there might be some farmer bro multi-millionaire coming in to fund an org just as a bit of a lark, just as fun. That's why they did that. They wanted to get that guy out the ecosystem, not because he was a danger to the ecosystem, but because he might have a relationship that could yield more money than they might be able to raise. Remember, this is pre-VC. We're just getting to the start of it. We're just getting to the tip of that. So that's the kind of shit they engaged in. So what the fuck do you think they did to someone like Alex Garfield? They fucking crucified him. And they used every piece of leverage they had and every connection they had to do it. In many ways, I often wonder if the reporting I did at that time with the talent agency license thing, I often wonder if I got used as a useful idiot. You know, someone must have planted that seed somewhere along the line, right? Or do I just wake up with that brilliant idea and just go do it myself? Who knows? I had a lot of conversations in a lot of bars, you know, at that time. And
Sure,
people, you know, some people, sometimes they treat me like the fucking Duracell bunny, you know, they put the battery in and watch me go. So I don't know. But I mean, but what I do know is what happened to EG, Alliance, Alex Garfield at this time. It's criminal. It ruined Alex's life. It ruined Evil Geniuses as an org and an entity. They were on life support after this, and Twitch had to basically give them, you know, life again. But this is the start of the rocky road. You know, this is the foundations being laid for a Peak 6 to ultimately come in. This is where it all goes wrong for EG.
Yep. And effectively, guys, the end of this chapter of the EG files is when they leave Twitch. And there wasn't, basically, Twitch had a useless asset at this point in time because they couldn't actually operate this esports team that they had purchased normally. And so eventually what ends up happening is that the Dota players, because Dota becomes the premier division of EG after, you know, with their win at TI in 2015. And then afterwards, especially with like the star power of players like Arteezy, who are, you know, internationally renowned superstars. basically, they couldn't. The players are agitating, and they say we can't operate a team like this because we can't get other players to play with us because of these conditions that have been imposed on this roster by Twitch and by Amazon. And so eventually, because there wouldn't be any value in the team as it continued to just lose players and die, Twitch made a decision to kind of return ownership of the EG brand to the Dota players. Is that fair to say? Is that an accurate assessment, Richard?
I mean, sure. The problem is, by this point, I don't know if it's a legal thing or just a health thing, but Alex didn't touch any of this again. He just. I imagine.
I think he was working on mostly larger Twitch sponsorships at that point in time because he could no longer work on EG, basically, given the parameters that had been laid out.
But I also think he stopped working for Twitch as well. I think he walked away from that in the middle of the dispute.
Not until his stock vested, I'll tell you.
Yeah.
That.
Well, yeah, sure. But ultimately, Twitch were left with this weird spot where it's like, okay, we bought these assets essentially that we can't. It's going to be a constant problem if we maintain ownership of them. So ultimately, they went and found some of the other people that had historically been at EG, some players, some managers, and basically said, okay, it's yours now. And they did the same for Alliance, which, as I said, that's how my life gets fucked up in 2015. Because when the DreamHack Hell in a Cell incident, this is what everyone always forgets about this detail. When Loader, who played for Alliance, a Twitch-owned company, came backstage, tried to start a fight with me, got sat in an act of self-defense. It didn't go further than it had to. I didn't hurt him. I stopped him hurting me, as ruled by Swedish police, and yet I'll still never live it down for some reason. Despite that, never arrested, never in police custody. All the eyewitnesses say, yeah, he tried to start a fight, and then Richard just went like that, and that was the end of it, right? And everybody was there, all agrees, right? It doesn't matter, because what happened to me was I heard the sound of the big fucking machine getting started up to tap dance on my fucking throat, and here's what it was: Kelly Milkeys works for Twitch. She's his girlfriend and manager at Alliance. DreamHack is streamed on Twitch, so. What do you think happens? Literally what happened was the manager of DreamHack took my phone off me and said, right, it's just a precaution to make sure you can't tweet about it. Pushed me outside into the freezing cold in a car park, locked the door, the fire escape, one way open. So I'm just stood outside waiting for the police to conclude their investigation. Then they open the door, come back in and say, oh yeah, we didn't take Loader's phone and he's tweeted that you attacked him. Right? I was like, oh, okay. And then I look over, and I can see Alliance employee screaming at DreamHack management, saying she is going to tell Twitch about this, and if they do not kick me out of the building, and if they let me go on stream and finish the show I was doing, she is going to ruin their DreamHack deal, ruin their Twitch deal. That's so. What do you think DreamHack did? They concocted a bullshit story that stuck. And, dude, it was surreal. It was like being on that fucking Noel Edmonds game show. They brought me out a telephone and said, Loader's in the hospital. Not the hospital. I didn't name that hard. No, he's in the hotel and he wants to talk to you on the phone. And he said, look, mate, I've deleted my tweet. I'm on a phone talking to him. He's like, look, mate, I've deleted my tweet. But what I'm worried about is that you might say things when you leave. So DreamHack are going to ask you to sign an NDA. And I'm like, well, I'm not signing an NDA, mate. Not about this. I would really like it if you did. Yeah, I don't give a fuck what you like, mate. This is all your fault. So, meanwhile, Grey Khan is sat next to me with Adebisi, and they're smiling, yes, sign the NDA, yes. None of this happens to me, by the way, if fucking Alex doesn't sell good game. So maybe fuck Alex Garfield again. Maybe now it's back on, motherfucker. I'm coming for it. That's just how ridiculous esports is. That's the insane twisted web that you have to live in to just sort of work in this business. So naturally, Alex eventually fell afoul of it, despite being one of the early masters.
All right. Any final thoughts on the up until the end of the Twitch era? Because I think that's where we're going to leave it for the time being. Because the next episode is going to be about kind of the post Twitch era when it was returned to the players up until the Peak 6 acquisition. And then we get into all the more recent drama and kind of collecting it for you in one place. Because unfortunately, a lot of the EG bullshit has now been it came out in drips and drabs, right? You've got a whole series of articles about it, Richard, but it's never really been like put all together in one unified whole, which is kind of the point. One of the points of what we're doing here.
I was gonna write an article about it actually after Duncan's recent content with Edward, the
My Buddy Esports guy.
My Buddy Esports, yeah, because he explicitly talks about the Danny situation there. And the quotes are kind of damning of the org. And at this point, it's like, can we just acknowledge the existence of the big League of Legends censorship machine? Can we just acknowledge it now? Can we just acknowledge that, like, fucking, a guy that carried water to excuse what happened at EG is now the league commissioner? Riot Games are never concluding that investigation if they ever began it. Seems to me, based on what I've been told, they were telling people not to talk to anyone else about it, actually. They were putting out a fire. They weren't getting to the bottom of a behavioral problem. Or Travis Gafford, who doesn't even date Nicole anymore, still recuses himself as if he does. The moderators delete any mention of her name and now her new name on LinkedIn from the subreddit, and no serious journalist has written anything critical about it. The closest we come was that DigiDay puff piece on the day she left, where when asked, do you think you could have handled the Danny situation better? I have nothing to apologize for. Yeah, it's super interesting, right? Like I keep telling people, these aren't just voices in my fucking head, like this is real shit. And I interviewed dozens.
By the way, just as an aside, since I'm on this tip now, since he called me out, by the way, one of fucking good old Jacob Wolf's best mates did one of that article, that shit DigiD piece, was that wanker Alexander Lee. That's the sort of people Jacob Wolf rubs shoulders with, people who actually do literal media harm to our industry and are here to omit real information to make a fake fucking powder puff version of the industry. So this guy did like a giant fucking profile piece on Nicole Point Jameson. Think of the date here, guys. At the end of August 2023, and managed to only reference any of the fucked up shit in a way where it was like almost like he was her media handler helping her clean it up. Which, by the way, the joke there would be, Jacob, you very much are the Travis Gafford, mate, because that's what Travis Gafford does for Riot executives, isn't it? So it's weird how when it comes to calling out corruption, you're never able to look in, I don't know, the fucking mirror for yourself and all the people around you, you daft cunt. You're the ones literally doing the things you say abstractly are harming the industry. But anyway, enough about that investment you took in that giant salary, mate. Enough about that. Put that back in the box. Pandora's box goes back on the shelf for now. Yeah. Thorin hasn't done the video yet. It's all good. It's all good.
But it's you're right. It's like it's ridiculous that all that work, all the essential chronicling of everything that went wrong, it's basically been boiled down to 2 Dexerto articles, and the rest is on my Substack. I haven't really seen anybody else tackle what was going on at Evil Geniuses. And this is, and listen, the one thing I will agree with them is, yeah, okay, it is systemic. It didn't just affect one guy one time by accident. It was certainly a problem, the way the org was run and the people that were there and the things that they did. But ultimately, we have never, there's this insane incuriosity about the individuals and what they were doing and why they were doing it and what the end goal was. And as I said, they're all going to get to walk away from it like pretty much unscathed. I mean, Evil Geniuses now, the new the management that are there now for this, like, I don't know, I don't even know what they're doing. It's more like a funeral rite, I suppose, at the moment. But the people that are like looking after EG at the moment, they keep constantly trying to do this thing in public where they're trying to win people back, and they're like, look, we're not the ones you should hate. We're the ones trying to put the fire out. They find, and it was like you still had Nicole's picture,
but they won't
up on
condemn the people.
Yeah,
and the problem is that they won't condemn the people who did the thing or admit to it. And you can't say like these are different people when these people all work there and none of them have said anything publicly, and the org hasn't announced the people who did those things. So
Yeah.
you can't have it both ways.
Which you
they
have a
need to-
vested interest in doing now. How can you move on
Yep.
from the past?
It's very weird.
If you're not willing to denounce it, and obviously
why
they
can't they just throw the people under the bus? Like that's the question.
Well,
But anyway,
I imagine because of the entanglement still related to the sale and the extrication of Peak
Sure.
6. So, you know, the problem we've got here is ultimately that, you know, as I said, the seeds that we planted here in this episode, which was a nice trip down memory lane for all of us, but
Sure.
ultimately this is what brings, you know, kind of like Activision Blizzard being acquired by Microsoft. It is rank incompetence and, you know, failures of other people that enable sort of the predatory takeover of Peak 6 when EG is absolutely financially on its knees and trying to keep the lights on, where, you know, the next chapter, and we'll have a guest for that as well. So that's what we'll be talking about
also,
next.
you know, this is we need to go over this to show the prestige and the power and the legacy of this org, because that is what makes the eventual downfall that much more unpalatable, because it's a pillar of North American esports and does have brand cachet. And a lot of people who, like us, who are around at that time, think fondly of the EG brand, or at least recognize its power, even if we didn't love it. And how well run it was. And it is, in some sense, a tragedy to see it kind of just go in the shitter after all of these years of being the dominant North American esports team.
I mean, put it this way, it's one thing to like chase after Moby Dick, you know, but like you are going to feel sad when you see that fucking big, beautiful whale speared and bleeding blubber all over the beach, you know, like you're always going to get a pang of sadness. And I went for years thinking that like EG were just this, you know, outrageous entity in NA, and they were doing all these things and nobody else could get a scrap off the table, and they just had everything sewed up from the media onwards. And yet I'm very sad to see the times that have befallen them of late.
Yes,
and
indeed.
I look back on this time with a comparative fondness.
Here's what I would say.
Right,
here's how you know that even though in some sense Alex Garfield was very precedent about trends and changes and pivots in the esports industry, he was only Paul Atreides. He wasn't actually Leto II, who could see the whole golden path. Because unfortunately, the irony of Alex Garfield's career is this exact period we're talking about, around 2014, where he thinks, this is something else Jacob Wolf might appreciate, he thinks, I've completed esports, time for me to pivot out of the industry. The real irony is he was 10 years too early, and he actually missed the period where his skill set would have like supernovaed the industry. Because on every level, this is when teams then took in $30 million in VC money. This is when people came along who wanted to be rivals to Twitch. And I'll tell you what, if someone like Alex Garfield had been with a rival that had been going against Twitch, you might have actually had a fucking game there, mate. You could have actually had an interesting battle. Similarly, in the media landscape, you could actually argue in the modern day, most people don't understand how to maintain sponsorships, deliverables, or create brands, etc. The joke is EG themselves later showed they retained none of the seeds of what Alex Garfield did and were just absolutely in name only evil geniuses. So the funny thing is, because at the time no one thought esports would ever get bigger, that's the real joke no one ever has the guts to actually fucking admit. Every single here's the analogy for you Zoomers. Every time esports hits its all-time high, everyone sells. They don't hodl thinking that Bitcoin will go to 1 million per coin. They don't. What they do is when they get to the all-time high, and the joke is in this analogy, Alex Garfield sold at the 5k Bitcoin all-time high. They just go, lol, this shit's never going anywhere, so I'm selling all my bags now. So the real irony of the episode is that Alex Garfield could, if he'd just actually chosen to delay retirement sort of from the industry 10 years, could have done like even more shit. Like he actually had completed the small version of esports, but essentially the version of the last 10 years where it was billions coming in and out the margin columns, actually he was somewhat absent from. That's kind of the crazy part about this story is he did kind of just bounce at one point in time. In some ways, he's sort of like an esports JD Salinger, right? He just did all this shit and then just gone. And there's not and in fact, the joke is, aside from people like you who've talked to him in real life, he's barely ever popped his head up, except the odd tweet in about 10 years, right?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, it's a fucking shame, dude. Right. pinning it, Christopher?
I think for now, this is going to be, as I said, guys, we'll pick this narrative back up with the return of EG to the players post exit from Twitch. And we'll probably have to do that after the major of CS. But until then, guys, as usual, esports still end to est.